At the age of 19, a young woman vanished from her home under rather mysterious circumstances, leaving her car abandoned in the middle of a bridge. Police efforts to locate her were fruitless, leading the investigation to a dead end until an unexpected and shocking turn of events shed light on the truth, deeply shaking the investigators. Sarah Stern was born on March 24, 1997, in Neptune, a small town in New Jersey, USA. From her childhood, she exhibited a passion for the arts, finding joy in painting, and was an active athlete, participating in school swimming and softball teams. Tragedy struck Sarah's family when she was 16, as her mother passed away from cancer, leaving her to live with her father and their beloved dog, Buddy. After graduating high school, Sarah chose to pursue her interest in the arts by enrolling in a local college, majoring in art and television production. As she delved deeper into her studies, she seriously considered the idea of moving to Canada after completing her education. In late 2016, as Sarah turned 19, her father had to leave town for a couple of days, leaving her alone at their home. She planned to enjoy her friends' company and relax over the upcoming weekend. However, the forthcoming events would radically alter her plans. Around 2:30 a.m. on December 3rd, a taxi driver called 911, reporting that he had seen an unattended car parked on the bridge's shoulder, which he found suspicious and decided to alert the police. A patrol officer was dispatched and found the car's doors unlocked with the keys left in the ignition. After running the plates, it was revealed the car belonged to 86-year-old Lily Stern. The police immediately went to her house, but the elderly woman explained that her granddaughter, Sarah, used the car. Trying to reach her, Lily found that Sarah was not responding to calls. The police went to Sarah's house, only to find her missing. Based on limited information, the police developed an alarming hypothesis. Sarah might have intentionally driven to the bridge to leave her car and jump into the water. However, the investigation continued with other possible explanations being considered. The police pondered recreating the sequence of events leading up to the disappearance, trying to figure out what Sarah had been doing. They considered the possibility that she might have stayed overnight with acquaintances, hence began checking her social circle. Information was received that Sarah spent most of her time with her devoted friend Liam. Detectives visited his residence in the morning. Liam confirmed that after leaving their morning meeting, he had not seen Sarah since he had gone to his evening job, and there had been no contact since. The police questioned him about any problems or challenges Sarah might have had, to which Liam provided significant information. Being her childhood friend, he was aware of her trials. Her mother's death had profoundly affected her, plunging her into a state of despondency or even depression. He didn't dismiss the possibility of her drastic action. Liam also mentioned her ambitions to move to Canada, considering her recent social media posts about an impending relocation, which suggested that Sarah might have left to escape all her troubles, cutting ties with her family and friends. Immediately after speaking with Liam, the police gathered additional information by conversing with a woman living next door to Sarah. It turned out that on the crucial day, Sarah had appeared at her door with an unusual request. She handed the neighbor a box filled with items belonging to her deceased mother, asking her to temporarily keep them. Owing to her friendship with Sarah's mother, the neighbor accepted the request without further questions. The woman's daughter also shared with the officers that she had planned a meeting with Sarah that evening, but Sarah never showed up. These actions raised the investigators' suspicions, especially considering her unexplained disappearance. Transferring her mother's personal belongings seemed like preparation for a flight or an even more tragic outcome. While one group of detectives explored the possibility that Sarah might have left town, another group organized a search operation. They determined that it was necessary to search the river under the bridge where her car was found for any sign of her body. However, they encountered a problem. The river's swift current could have carried the body many kilometers from where she presumably fell into the water around 2 in the morning. Despite these difficulties, professional divers were engaged, and volunteers were recruited to thoroughly search both banks and the adjacent areas. During this critical time, Sarah's father, being far from home, hurried back to the city to participate in the search. He appealed to the media to assist in spreading information about Sarah's disappearance and aid in her search, emphasizing the importance of any information that could shed light on the circumstances of her disappearance. Later that day, the investigators revisited Liam, aiming to gain a more accurate understanding of the events on the day Sarah disappeared and to identify any indications of her possible intentions. Liam recounted that they spent most of the day at her house, playing video games, and only left once, after Sarah had taken her mother's items to the neighbor. Following that, they visited a local Taco Bell before returning to Sarah's house. When asked about her emotional state, Liam candidly disclosed that Sarah had been experiencing profound emotional turmoil after her mother's death and had even once attempted suicide, but fortunately survived. He also mentioned that one factor contributing to her depression was her strained relationship with her father, who, according to her, had used some of the money left by her mother without her consent. This intensified her desire to leave for Canada as soon as possible. The detectives also reached out to the neighbors, and at one of the houses, they found a security camera that covered Sarah's house. Reviewing the footage, they confirmed Liam's account. It showed them leaving the house and coming back. The footage also showed that around 5 p.m., Liam left for work, and at 11:45 p.m., Sarah's grandmother's car was seen leaving the garage, presumably driven by Sarah herself. A few hours later, when the police arrived at her home, Sarah was already gone, and she had not been seen on camera since noon. All the gathered facts led the investigators to the somber supposition that Sarah might indeed have jumped from the bridge. While the divers continued their unsuccessful search in the river waters, finding neither Sarah nor her personal belongings, the police did not cease interrogating her circle of acquaintances. They summoned Preston to the station, who lived in the same building as Liam and was also Sarah's classmate and friend, having even accompanied her to the prom night. Preston confirmed that Sarah was experiencing psychological difficulties and had conflicts with her father. Hence, he did not rule out the possibility of her radical actions or escape to Canada. At the end of the meeting, visibly distressed, Preston broke down in tears and was then released by the detectives. The investigators proceeded with the investigation, inspecting Sarah's room where they found her personal documents and Canadian currency, intensifying suspicions of her possible flight. However, the documents left at home suggested otherwise. Recalling Liam's mention of a significant sum left by her mother, the police discovered Sarah's bank safe containing $25,000, untouched since her disappearance, casting doubt on her flight plans. Further investigation led them to the bank Sarah visited on December 2nd, the day of her disappearance. Reviewing the surveillance footage, they observed her brief presence in the bank but were unable to ascertain the purpose of the visit. This prompted the police to question Liam again, demanding an explanation for omitting Sarah's bank visit that day. The young man confirmed that they had gone to the bank together, adding that he had mentioned this in a conversation with other officers. Liam also recalled, unaware of why she wanted to enter, but noted her habit of regularly withdrawing funds from her bank account. He described how Sarah came into possession of those finances, which occurred just a few months before her disappearance, when she and Liam visited a residence owned by her late mother to inspect some items. There, Sarah stumbled upon a shoebox filled with banknotes, saved by her mother over her lifetime, and assembled into this box to leave for Sarah, who found them only 3 years later. All the bills were old, so she decided to deposit most of them in the bank and spend the rest at her discretion. The investigators deduced that Sarah was unlikely to have left the country without these funds, especially without her documents, almost entirely dismissing the possibility of her moving to Canada. The alternative scenario, suggesting she might have jumped into the river, also became increasingly unlikely. Detectives spoke with other friends and acquaintances of Sarah, all of whom insisted she was a very cheerful person, showing no signs of despondency or destructive behavior. On the contrary, some friends emphasized that after her mother's passing, Sarah became even more appreciative of life. Her father refuted any issues in their relationship, asserting he never took any money from her and noticed nothing in her behavior that could indicate depression. In addition to the circumstances, the efforts to find the young woman day after day were unsuccessful. The rescue divers were unable to locate either her or her personal belongings. The investigators considered the possibility that she might have been swept out to sea, where the chances of finding her would be minimal. This situation lasted for over a month, while her family and friends maintained hope of finding Sarah alive. However, 5 weeks after her disappearance, an unexpected twist occurred. A young man named Anthony, who was Sarah's former classmate and a close friend of Liam's, approached the detectives. He was passionate about filmmaking, especially horror films. Liam, who also had a keen interest in this genre, regularly shared with Anthony script ideas that he could potentially turn into reality. A few weeks before Sarah's disappearance, Liam shared a story with him about a guy who strangled his girlfriend and threw her body off a bridge. At the time, Anthony didn't think much of it, as his friend often came up with such ideas, and this seemed to him just another one in their series. After Sarah's disappearance, he hadn't even heard about the incident. They weren't close friends in school, and they hardly communicated after its conclusion. Nevertheless, Liam's behavior began to seem odd. He repeatedly reached out to Anthony, inquiring whether the police had contacted him. Initially, Anthony couldn't understand how this was related to him, but when he learned about Sarah's disappearance at the bridge, he recalled the story his friend had told. At that moment, it dawned on him, and he decided to go to the police to share this information. Following this, the detectives realized that the investigation was likely linked to a murder. However, they faced several serious challenges. Firstly, Sarah's body had not been found, and secondly, even if Liam was indeed guilty, there were no concrete pieces of evidence to charge him. The investigators then began to devise a plan and asked Anthony for help. Their only hope to uncover the truth was to obtain a confession, so they proposed that Anthony try to coax his friend into confessing. Initially, they decided to try this over the phone. In the presence of the police, Anthony called Liam on speakerphone and concocted a story about his camera breaking down and urgently needing money. He asked his friend if he could lend him a substantial sum. The detectives crafted this scenario, assuming that Liam might have had financial motives for the murder, aiming to acquire Sarah's money. However, Liam immediately suggested that they meet in person to discuss the details. The police realized that Liam was wary of being wiretapped, so they had to develop a new strategy. They instructed Anthony to go to the meeting with his friend and continue playing along, claiming his camera was broken, and also try to ascertain his views on Sarah. Detectives quickly installed a hidden camera in his car, and Anthony headed to the agreed-upon location. He parked, and soon Liam got into the car with him. To Anthony's surprise, Liam immediately began searching for bugs, asserting that the FBI was monitoring him. Hence, he needed to be sure their conversation wasn't being overheard. He inspected the area around his seat and patted down Anthony's clothing, but didn't find the hidden camera. He then apologized to his friend and mentioned he needed to be cautious. Anthony played along and asked what was going on. In response, Liam began to share his story, shocking not only his friend but also the detectives listening in. He confessed that everything had been planned by him several months ago. Liam knew the police would question him, so his primary aim was to deflect suspicion away from himself. Following this, Liam immediately noted that the worst part of the entire situation was his expectation of acquiring far more money. He had hoped to find about $100,000, or at least half of that amount, at Sarah's home. However, the 2 safes he had taken contained only $10,000. Liam also complained that the bills were severely worn, and he feared using them as the police might recognize them. Anthony continued playing along and asked where he kept the money. Liam responded that he initially kept the money at his place but then decided to hide it, as he had lost trust in Preston. Anthony immediately inquired about Preston's involvement. Liam explained that he had assisted in the matter and added that a few hours ago they had attempted to rob a local jewelry dealer and had broken into his house, only to find out that the man had recently moved away. Liam then disclosed that they had dumped Sarah's body off the bridge and it had yet to surface. Anthony hardly asked any questions, but Liam continued to elaborate. He then proceeded to describe the events of that day. Liam recounted that Sarah had gone to the bank and withdrawn some money. After returning home, they counted the bills, and at that moment, Liam approached her from behind and began to strangle her. He mentioned being worried about her dog's reaction, but the pet just watched, not barking. He had hoped the murder would take only a few minutes, but Sarah kept breathing. Then he took her shirt and stuffed it in her mouth. He also mentioned that he had set a timer on his phone, and the entire process took nearly half an hour. After the murder, he dragged the body to the bathroom and went to work to create an alibi. En route, he discovered he had lost his phone and realized he had likely dropped it at Sarah's house. Liam also mentioned that Preston got involved while he was at work, dragging the body from the bathroom to the bushes. Fearing his phone might be found in the house, he left work several times briefly and went searching for it, communicating with his friend using walkie-talkies they had purchased beforehand. Eventually, he managed to find the smartphone on the lawn in front of Sarah's house. At night, when his shift ended, he returned to Sarah's house. Knowing about the neighbor's camera, he always stayed in its blind spot to avoid detection. Liam placed his friend's body in the front seat of her car to drive it to the bridge where Preston was supposed to meet him. Waiting for the moment when the road would be clear of other cars, Liam set about extracting the body. However, he soon realized he had greatly overestimated his physical abilities. Although Sarah was light, he found it very difficult to move her. As soon as he managed to get her out of the car at the passenger seat near the bridge, 3 cars unexpectedly approached. Liam hastily tried to put her back, but at that critical moment, he twisted his ankle. He was consumed with fear that the passing drivers might notice him. Nonetheless, he managed to place the body back in the car just seconds before the cars drove by. Preston arrived at the bridge just in time to help Liam dispose of Sarah's body into the water. After the deed was done, Liam confessed that he had shared this secret not only with one person. He also expressed dissatisfaction with earning less money than he had anticipated, but claimed that this amount would suffice for him to live luxuriously and have parties with friends for some time. Liam expressed hope that the saga with Sarah was now completely finished and that the police would never be able to find him. After hearing his story, Anthony stated it was time for him to go home. They said their goodbyes, and Liam got out of his car. With the recorded confession in hand, the detectives immediately proceeded to Preston, bringing him in for interrogation. As soon as the young man learned about Liam's incriminating statements, he promptly corroborated the story described by his friend and confessed to their joint act of disposing of Sarah's body in the river. He then detailed the planning and execution of the crime alongside Liam, subsequently agreeing to lead the investigators to Sarah's house, showing them where the body was found and how he camouflaged it among the bushes. The young man also guided them to a wooded area where Sarah's safe was hidden, which contained her money that the police subsequently discovered. With the confessions and evidence at hand, law enforcement arrested both youths. Upon Liam's arrival at the police station and the inspection of his belongings, a key to Sarah's safe was found among his keys. During interrogation, Liam insisted that his confession to the murder was mistaken, suggesting the entire scenario was a casting for a horror movie that Anthony was supposedly filming, and he had hoped to get a role. However, this did not affect the course of the investigation, and the case was forwarded to court. Preston, having agreed to a plea deal with the prosecution and to testify against Liam, was charged with concealing the crime and disposing of the body, eventually leading to his sentence of 18 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years, considering he did not partake in the actual murder. As for Liam, he steadfastly maintained his claim of innocence. His defense focused on Sarah's body never being found, arguing that without it, her death could not be confirmed, and continued to push the narrative that Liam was involved in a casting for a horror film. Despite these arguments, they failed to convince the jury of his innocence. Consequently, Liam was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 10-year prison term. After the sentencing, his mother continued to assert her son's innocence, actively giving interviews and maintaining the theory that Sarah simply ran away from home and would owe Liam an apology upon her return. Sarah's father, deprived of the chance to bury his daughter, found another way to honor her memory by establishing a scholarship in Sarah's name for students passionate about art. After leaving the parking lot of her educational institution, Jody headed home but never appeared there. Her anxious relatives immediately sought help from the police, who started the search without delay. During the investigation, detectives uncovered several very troubling details about her disappearance, but even they could not anticipate the horrors that would later be revealed. When the truth about her fate finally came to light, It was so shocking that it led to changes in legislation, as no one could have foreseen such an outcome. Jody Sonderholm was born on September 26, 1987, in the small American town of Arkansas City, Kansas, into a large and harmonious family with a brother and an older sister. During her school years, Jody achieved significant success. She was the captain of the dance team for several years, received 2 scholarships, won first place in a physical competition, and was honored as Student of the Year. After school, she continued her education in college, majoring in pharmacy, and also joined the dance team. Since the college was in her hometown, Jody continued to live with her family. In January 2007, at the age of 19, she was actively preparing for an important performance with the dance team, requiring intense training. On the morning of January 5th, she arrived at college for another training session, which ended around 10:45. After the training, Jody planned to return home. On her way to the parking lot, she arranged to meet a friend in a few hours, said goodbye to her, got into her car, and left. However, her friend Lori was faced with an unpleasant discovery. Approaching her car, she found that one of the tires was completely flat, which seemed odd to her since everything had been fine with the tire just a few hours ago when she arrived for training. Lori thought that maybe she had accidentally driven over something sharp that caused the tire to puncture. As she pondered how to get home now, a passing man noticed her and offered his help in changing the tire. He noted that the tire damage looked unusual, as if someone had deliberately cut it with a knife, and clarified that if it had been run over by a sharp object of such size, the tire would have deflated immediately. These words alarmed Lori, and she decided to contact Jody to share her concerns. But her attempts to call were unsuccessful. The phone consistently went to voicemail. Lori assumed that Jody might be busy after training, possibly taking a shower or having lunch, so she decided to call back later. However, even several hours later, attempts to contact Jody again proved fruitless. For Lori, this seemed strange for several reasons. First, the journey from college to Jody's home took only a few minutes, and Jody should have finished all her errands by then. Second, they had arranged to meet, and Jody never disappeared without explanation. Eventually, concerned, Lori decided to go to her friend's house to make sure everything was all right. At the spot where Jody's car was supposed to be parked, it was missing, which only fueled Lori's alarm. The absence of the car hinted that Jody had gone somewhere. Lori speculated that her friend might have stopped by the store owned by her family, as Jody's mother spent a lot of time there, and Jody herself liked to visit her there. Upon arriving at the location, Lori found only Jody's mother, who was surprised to learn that her daughter had not appeared and had not answered calls for several hours. The mother confirmed that she too had tried to contact her daughter, to no avail. This seemed strange, as Jody was always in touch with her mother, regardless of her schedule, and always shared her plans for the day. Concern grew when the mother decided to seek help from the elder daughter living in another city. Considering that the elder sister was in her last month of pregnancy and was about to give birth, the mother believed that Jody would definitely respond to a call from her. However, even this call went unanswered, heightening the mother's alarm and causing her to consider the possible misfortunes that could have befallen her daughter. At this moment, Lori not only remembered her damaged tire, but also another recent incident that began to worry her even more. It all happened on the evening of January 1st, as she was returning home after a dance rehearsal. Leaving the college parking lot, Lori noticed a light Cadillac about to turn in front of her, but suddenly stopped, letting her pass. This seemed strange to her. Soon she noticed that the same car was following her closely, raising her suspicion that maybe the driver had intentionally let her pass to start following her. To test her suspicions, Lori began to make unexpected turns onto neighboring streets, all the while keeping an eye on the rearview mirror. To her surprise, the stranger in the Cadillac continued to stay behind her, only increasing her fear. In search of safety, Lori decided to drive straight to the nearest police station. Arriving at its parking lot, she began to observe the actions of the driver of the light Cadillac. He followed her all the way to the station, but, not entering the parking lot, drove past and disappeared from view. After spending some time in the parking lot of the station, pondering whether to report the incident to the police, Lori eventually decided that she might be exaggerating the danger. After all, she had not remembered the car's license plate or the driver's face, so in her opinion, she did not have enough grounds for a police report. Deciding that it could all be a simple coincidence, Lori drove home. This incident quickly faded from her memory, and she almost forgot about it until the morning of January 5th. Arriving for training at the college, Lori was about to get out of her car when she noticed the familiar Cadillac slowly driving past. This time, she managed to get a good look at the driver's face, who gave her a piercing look. It was a 20-year-old young man named Justin, who had been familiar to Lori for many years since he was in the same class as her older brother. Lori always felt a dislike for Justin, especially after an incident when her brother brought him and other friends home. That time, Justin silently observed Lori for a long time, not taking his eyes off her, causing her so much fear and discomfort that she had to ask her brother to kick him out, as she felt unsafe in his presence. This sudden visit by Justin to the college parking lot made Lori wonder if he was connected to her tire being punctured, especially since he had been spotted there that morning. Moreover, Lori remembered that Jody was also nearby and saw Justin driving past them at a slow speed. Later, on the way to practice, Lori shared this observation with Jody, but by that time she no longer felt as anxious. Despite his odd behavior in the past, Lori had known Justin for many years and quickly dismissed her fears, deciding that what had happened was merely a coincidence. Lori shared all the details with Jody's mother, after which the latter's alarm only intensified. The woman went home and discovered that her daughter had not returned. She noticed that Jody usually came home after her classes to take a shower, but this time the bathroom remained dry. Also, Jody always brought home the mail and newspapers from the box, leaving them in the hallway. But this time, that hadn't happened. By the evening around 6 p.m., the parents' concern had turned into real alarm, and they decided to call the police. Despite Jody being only 19 years old and only a few hours having passed since her disappearance, the police took the matter seriously. The local sheriff, well acquainted with the family, understood from their words that the situation was serious and that something untoward might indeed have happened to the girl. The parents also mentioned her boyfriend Colby, with whom Jody had been in a relationship for 5 years. He lived in the same town, but lately he often traveled to Texas to visit his brother. The police reasoned that perhaps Jody might have gone to him, which would explain her absence. However, after talking to Colby, who claimed he hadn't seen Jody since he left for Texas, it became clear that the situation was different. This prompted the police to immediately begin a search operation around the town and its surroundings. The possibility that Jody had been involved in a car accident on one of the lesser-used roads, which were plentiful in the county of their small town, was considered. However, this scenario raised questions, considering that Jody's route from college to home went through the town's central streets. During the search, the police also took into account Lori's story about Justin's suspicious behavior, deciding to have a talk with him. They visited his house, and the young man shared that he had spent most of the day at a lake with friends, located 25 kilometers from the town, a place popular among locals for relaxation and fishing. Justin claimed that they had stayed there all day, and at one point their car got stuck in the mud. Attempts to pull the car out were unsuccessful, leading to an argument among friends. Eventually, Justin walked away from the group, went out to the road, and called his father to ask for a pickup. His father, who was present at home during the police visit, confirmed this story, adding that he indeed picked up his son from the lake. After talking to Justin, the police continued to survey the area. Throughout the night, patrol officers scanned the area, hoping to find any trace of Jody or her car, but their search was unsuccessful. With dawn, the police sought support from the community of volunteers, as news of the girl's disappearance spread rapidly among the residents, drawing attention and a desire to help from many. That same day, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation offered its cooperation to the local police chief, who, despite a usual aversion to external interference, accepted the offered assistance. Investigators quickly got to work, re-interviewing Jody's boyfriend upon his return and confirming his non-involvement in the disappearance based on his bank card usage and witness statements indicating his presence in another state. The search operation expanded by the hour, attracting more volunteers ready to join the search at the police station. Search teams methodically checked all places where Jody's car could be. Meanwhile, investigators' attention increasingly focused on Justin, as he remained the only one who aroused their suspicions. For a more thorough investigation, they began surveillance of his home and a detailed check of his alibi. The previous day, investigators had called in 3 of Justin's friends to the station to confirm his alibi. However, the police were met with an unexpected turn. Each friend denied seeing Justin on the day of Jody's disappearance, let alone visiting the lake together. This revelation prompted detectives to immediately consider Justin as the primary suspect in the disappearance. Nevertheless, additional evidence was required for an arrest, and investigators intensified their efforts to find clues. Further investigation revealed that Justin had recently ended a relationship with a girl named Alexis, and the detectives decided to meet with her. To their surprise, Alexis not only agreed to the meeting, but also suggested they meet in the big park located near the town. She shared that Justin was almost obsessed with this place, where many residents sought solitude in nature. However, he visited it much more frequently than usual, sometimes expressing himself very strangely. She recalled one of their joint visits during which, standing on the riverbank, Justin stated that if he ever killed someone and dumped the body there, it would never be found. Alexis emphasized that his words did not sound like a joke, but rather as an expression of a real intention to commit something terrible. In the context of Jody's disappearance, Alexis's story seemed particularly troubling to the investigators. She mentioned Justin's cruelty, especially noting his behavior during moments of intimacy when he had a habit of strangling her. These details only intensified the suspicions towards him, resulting in search teams being directed to the specified park. Concurrently, an analysis of security camera footage from the college showed that Justin regularly visited the campus, even though he was not a student. The footage captured him watching members of the dance team, including the morning of Jody's disappearance, when he was also recorded by the cameras. Unfortunately, the video did not cover the section of the parking lot where Lori's car was parked, thus not allowing to confirm whether he was involved in damaging her tire. However, the footage showed Justin exiting his car and heading in the direction where Lori's transport was located before returning back. This occurred while Lori was at practice. All the gathered facts intensified the suspicions of his possible involvement in Jody's disappearance, although direct evidence was still lacking. Nevertheless, they found a way to arrest the young man on other charges. It turned out that just a few days before, Justin had been arrested for illegal trespassing. The judge had released him on bail, but detectives contacted this judge and informed him about the ongoing investigation. As a result, the judge revoked the bail and Justin was detained. This allowed the police to search his home in hopes of finding new clues, as well as to reinterrogate his father. The man insisted that he had told the truth and had indeed picked up his son near the lake before bringing him home. The father clarified that Justin was covered in mud and immediately took a shower upon arriving home, then began cleaning his boots. The police seized the boots and took photos of the soles, hoping it would aid in the investigation. Additionally, they confiscated Justin's phone and car, but this did not yield any new leads. At dawn the next day, the investigative team was informed about a location according to cell network data provided by Jody's mobile service provider. This information caught their attention because on the day of the young woman's disappearance, her cell phone pointed towards a specific park, a frequent destination for Justin. This fact prompted the police to conduct an intensified examination of that area. That same day, one of the search teams discovered on the ground a pair of tracks, one belonging to large boots, likely a man's size, and the other to smaller flip-flops, suggesting women's footwear. It's important to note that Jody was wearing flip-flops on the day she went missing. A few dozen meters from where the tracks were found, the flip-flop tracks suddenly stopped, and only the men's shoe prints continued. This led the investigators to a grim conclusion. Possibly, someone had forced or threatened the young woman into the woods, and at a certain point, she began to resist. It is assumed that after this, the man might have attacked her, and leaving her unconscious, continued to carry her further. However, the tracks did not lead to the discovery of any new evidence, and with the onset of darkness, the search was reluctantly suspended. Some members of the search team decided to drive past the lake where Justin reportedly spent time with friends on the day of the disappearance. This route was on their way, and they hoped to use the opportunity to survey the area for clues. Arriving at the local parking lot near the lake, they quickly noticed something unusual on the asphalt next to the path leading to the public restrooms: sharp tire tracks, as if someone had lost control. Exploring the surroundings, the volunteers found shoe prints on the ground near the restrooms. One of the searchers decided to check inside the restrooms, which were no more than pit latrines, and using a flashlight found items resembling letters and other papers in one of them. In another restroom, he was drawn to a bright women's jacket, a purse, and a single woman's flip-flop. Immediately contacting the police, they retrieved the items, which were quickly identified as belonging to Jody. Her personal documents were found in the purse. Furthermore, other items that could belong to the young woman were discovered in the restrooms, including dance shoes, shorts, pants, as well as a car mat and a seat cover. Although Jody had not yet been found, the discovery of her personal items was a disturbing sign for the investigative team, reinforcing the belief that the chances of finding her alive were minimal. The focus of the detectives now shifted to searching for her body. For Jody's loved ones, the news about the found items turned into a deep shock. All this time, the family had been living in hope that she would be found alive, but the recent developments had almost destroyed all hope. Jody's older sister had given birth to a child exactly the day after the disappearance and received this information while in the hospital with the newborn in her arms. She shared that at those moments, her mind could not fully grasp that the most terrible and joyful events in her life were happening simultaneously. The day after Jody's belongings were discovered, the police redirected the search team's efforts towards the lake and its vicinity, considering that personal items had been found there. Considering the possibility that Jody's body could be nearby, the detectives noted the tire tracks leading into the water, which could indicate that the young woman's car was dumped into the lake. Divers were brought in to spend the day diving to the bottom in hopes of finding the car, but to no avail. The lake turned out to be quite extensive, and even a small portion of it required significant time for a thorough examination. At this point, the investigative team sought assistance from a Texas-based nonprofit organization specialized in underwater searches. Over the years, this organization had provided invaluable help in solving many cases, finding evidence in hundreds of instances. Founded in memory of the creator's abducted and murdered daughter, it initially was a small group of volunteers supporting the police in searches for the missing. Over time, it transformed into a large professional structure with advanced technical equipment not always available to police stations, including boats with radar, helicopters, and drones with various sensors. Joining the search operation the next morning, they began scanning the lake's water with radar technology on a boat. Very soon, the equipment detected an object on the bottom resembling the size of a car. Divers were immediately directed to the specified location, where they confirmed the discovery of a vehicle. After pulling the car ashore, inspectors easily determined it belonged to Jody. However, to their surprise, Jody was not found inside the vehicle. This led the investigators to reconsider the assumption that the body might be inside. The investigators realized that searching for evidence inside the vehicle was unlikely to yield any results, as all the windows were open, and after several days underwater, the interior was completely flooded, which could have destroyed any DNA or other important traces. However, despite this, specialists thoroughly inspected the interior, and to their surprise, the search proved fruitful. They found a single hair, which was immediately sent for laboratory analysis. While detectives awaited the DNA analysis results, search groups continued to explore the park area near the town. One of the volunteers discovered a suspicious pile of branches in the forest, appearing to be artificially created. Approaching, he saw a human hand sticking out from under the branches and immediately reported to the police. The investigators instantly realized they had found Jody and sent her body for forensic examination. The results showed that the cause of death was asphyxiation following a severe blow to the head. It was noted that considering the nature of the injuries, the attacker might have stopped the asphyxiation several times before it became fatal. Furthermore, numerous bruises were found on the victim's body, indicating a series of blows. Experts also concluded that the victim had been sexually assaulted, with traces of foreign DNA found on her body. These samples were too insubstantial for detailed analysis. However, when examining samples from under Jody's fingernails, Skin particles were discovered. DNA extracted from them matched Justin's DNA, confirming a match. As for the hair found in the victim's car, analysis showed that it belonged to Justin. These pieces of evidence gave investigators grounds to charge Justin with murder. He, in turn, denied any involvement in the crime. Nonetheless, based on the collected direct and circumstantial evidence, detectives formed a convincing version of events. The discovery of the body also led to additional evidence that furthered the investigation. The investigative team needed to determine the circumstances under which Justin managed to abduct Jody. That fateful morning, as she left the college parking lot, detectives were convinced that the young woman had made it home. Proof of this was the envelopes found in the restroom, delivered to her mailbox that same morning. One of the envelopes bore Jody's fingerprints, indicating that she had retrieved them from the box after returning home from her classes. Therefore, Justin must have carried out the abduction in the time between her arrival at home and entering the house. Confirming this theory, the police found men's shoe prints on the vacant lot opposite Jody's house, the tread pattern matching Justin's footwear. This led investigators to speculate that Justin might have been waiting for her, and when Jody approached the mailbox, he attacked her with a heavy object and then placed her in her own car. Alternatively, Justin could have threatened Jody, forcing her into the car. Then he presumably drove her to the park where detectives found new evidence. Jody's friend reported seeing her car that day, with a boy at the wheel who appeared much larger than her boyfriend Colby. Driving by, the friend waved, expecting a response from Jody, but there was none, and attempts to contact her by phone were unsuccessful. It was noted that the car was headed towards the mentioned park, which was corroborated by other witnesses who saw Justin and Jody together in the car near the park. Investigators surmised that Justin brought Jody to a secluded area of the park and threatened her into following him into the forest. The shoe prints on the ground confirmed their movement deeper into the forest, but at a certain point, Jody stopped following Justin, which provoked his aggression. After attacking her, he likely carried her further into the forest on his hands, where he committed violent acts, subsequently killing her and hiding the body under a layer of branches. According to forensic experts, the victim's torture and the act of murder took at least several hours. After Justin hid the body, he presumably used Jody's car to reach the lake, where the car was later found in the water. His initial plan likely included walking home, but due to the significant distance, he soon decided to call his father for assistance. Detectives are confident in this sequence of events and have gathered enough evidence for the case to proceed to court. But further investigation revealed even more disturbing information about Justin that shocked the investigation and added clarity to the suspect's personality profile. Two women contacted the police expressing concern for their safety: Justin's ex-girlfriend and a co-worker from the cafe. Both shared their stories of fear regarding Justin. The ex-girlfriend reported that before his arrest, he had sent her threatening messages, after which she noticed him lurking around her house. The cafe employee shared a story about one morning when she was opening the establishment. Justin approached her asking for a ride, explaining that his car had supposedly broken down. Despite the fact that he had worked there for a short time, the woman was seriously wary of him. The reason for this was his strange behavior. She said she had to work and didn't have time, so Justin left. Soon she saw him drive past the cafe at a slow speed, watching her. There seemed to be nothing wrong with his car, and he drove past the establishment several more times that day. The woman was so frightened that she decided to call the police and ask them to escort her home. The next morning, when she arrived to open the cafe, the lock was riddled with wood chips, and she had no doubt that Justin had done it. But all of this was just the tip of the iceberg that the detective was to learn about after the arrest. Other women began to come forward and share their stories. One said that in 2000, when she was 14 and Justin was 17, he tried to abuse her by holding a pillow over her face. Another woman said that in 2001, she worked with Justin at KFS and they got to talking in the parking lot after her shift. The guy was sitting in his car and she was standing next to the driver's door. At one point, Justin suddenly grabbed her and dragged her into the cabin through the window, then forced her to sit with him for several hours. Another time, he abused this girl, but she apparently did not report it to the police. That same year, he chased a girl who left a movie theater and headed home on foot. Justin followed her at a speed not exceeding 10 kilometers per h until she entered her house. The girl immediately told her mother about it, and the mother managed to memorize the license plate number before contacting the police. However, this time there was no investigation. Another girl reported that in 2004, she found a note from Justin in her car, which scared her a lot. In 2006, he told an acquaintance who was looking for a car to buy that he had a suitable one and offered her a ride to see it. He had an 11-year-old girl with him at the time, and they both got into Justin's car. However, he drove them into the woods, and as soon as he stopped, they were able to escape, running for several kilometers until they reached a farmhouse. The girl called the police from there, but this time too, Justin was not charged with anything. In the same year, Justin took another girl to the woods where he forced her to undress at knife point. There were also other women who told similar stories. Some of them went to the police, but each time Justin avoided responsibility. However, the most shocking story was shared with detectives by a boy who was friends with Justin as a child. He was about 12 years old at the time, and he told his friend that he liked to sneak to a house nearby and peek at two girls who were swimming in the pool. In addition to this, he would also peek at them through their bedroom window. These girls were Jody, who was about 9 years old at the time, and her older sister. The same friend told police that a few years later, when the older sister was 17, Justin would regularly pull into the parking lot in front of the movie theater where she worked the evening shift and watch her from the car for hours. All of this indicated that Justin had had unhealthy tendencies since childhood and had consistently committed crimes of varying severity throughout the years, but had never been held seriously accountable for them. The start of Justin's trial was postponed several times, and it did not begin until February 2009. Given the array of evidence and the number of witnesses who testified for the prosecution, the man had little chance of getting away with it. His attorneys, on the other hand, were unable to provide a single solid argument in favor of their client's innocence. Justin's trial was completed in the shortest possible time, in just 1 week, as a result of which the jury unequivocally found him guilty. The punishment was the death penalty, which could not be overturned on appeal. However, in 2018, Justin's lawyers managed to obtain a stay of execution, arguing that their client may have symptoms of mental retardation. Until now, Justin is still behind bars, and the final decision on his fate remains in question. Jody's family, quite expectedly, were outraged by the fact that for years, Justin had been committing crimes against women while the police ignored the complaints, thus allowing the criminal to remain at large. Determined to take the situation into their own hands, they engaged in a vigorous campaign to change the way law enforcement investigated harassment cases. Their efforts were successful. In 2009, a year after Jody's death, a stricter anti-harassment law was passed and named in her honor, a significant step in combating police inaction. Zoya Hastings set off for the evening mass at the temple, but was never spotted there. Growing worried, her parents reached out to the police for help, and then started their own search for their missing daughter. Detectives took on the case and soon uncovered alarming circumstances that led to the truth about what happened to Zoya. Born on November 21, 1996 in Kansas, Zoya was the eldest among 5 children, including 3 sisters and 1 brother. She actively helped her parents care for her younger siblings and was ready to give up her personal plans if needed. Her family, deeply religious, spent a lot of time in church events. After moving to Dallas, Zoya attended a high school with an arts program where she developed a passion for drawing and participated in school theater productions. In her free time from studies, she worked in a Dallas art studio and spent summers working as a lifeguard at the local pool. Zoya graduated with honors and had the chance to attend prestigious universities, but decided to postpone her education to dedicate time to serving in her church. In October 2015, as Zoya turned 18, she eagerly prepared for an upcoming pilgrimage with other members of her church community. She was particularly looking forward to a meeting on Sunday, October 11th, to discuss the trip plans. Intending to reach the church for Sunday prayer, Zoya took the family minivan, assuring her parents she would return by dinner, and left at 1641. The church was not far from their home, and she was expected to return around 1830. However, Zoya did not come home for dinner. Her worried parents sent her several messages but received no reply. After a while, they tried to contact her by phone, to no avail. Then they called her friends and acquaintances, hoping she might have stayed with someone after the service, but no one had seen Zoya that evening. Eventually deciding to check with the church, the parents faced an unexpected discovery. Zoya had never arrived. This heightened their anxiety, and they decided to contact the police. Such behavior was completely out of character for their responsible daughter, who always informed them of her whereabouts and never was late without prior notice. After calling 911 under unknown circumstances, law enforcement did not go to the parents to take a missing person report. Following this, the concerned family went to the local police station, where they filed an official statement and started their own search. Repeatedly walking the route from their home to the church and carefully checking the adjacent streets, they found no trace of Zoya. These efforts yielded no results until early morning. That's when the mother remembered about an iPhone location tracking app they had access to. It allowed them to determine that their daughter's phone was a few hundred meters away from the church building by a stream on the opposite side of the road. Immediately heading to the specified location, they were shocked by the presence of numerous police cars, medical, and rescue services on the scene. Upon asking one of the officers for help in searching for their daughter, they learned about a recent car accident in the area. The police were alerted by a witness who was walking his dog nearby when a person approached him and reported the incident at the stream. Together, they headed to the accident site, where the witness found an injured girl in a pool of blood and called the police. The police quickly identified the unfortunate victim as Zoya Hastings. It took law enforcement officers only a moment to realize that the girl's death was not caused by a car accident. Zoya had become the victim of a crime. She was found on the ground, just a few steps from the family minivan, partially submerged in the waters of the stream. Abundant traces of blood were noticed around her body, and knife wounds were observed on her neck. Zoya's parents, trying to approach their daughter, were stopped by the police, who strongly advised them against viewing such a horrific scene. Observations by the officers regarding the state of Zoya's clothing, specifically her dress being pulled up and her underwear being lowered, led to the suspicion that the perpetrator might have committed sexual violence against her. The investigation of the crime scene provided detectives with key clues. All the doors of the minivan, except for the driver's door, were found locked, which could indicate that the perpetrator controlled the vehicle or approached Zoya at the scene. Near the water, under a bridge near an embankment, a knife with bloodstains was found, presumably the weapon used in the crime. Data from the victim's mobile phone allowed for a quick reconstruction of the events that evening. According to location information, Zoya was by the stream at 17:01, just 20 minutes after she left her home. The investigation's theory suggests that the girl's life was cut short within minutes after the recorded time. Search efforts revealed that prior to her disappearance, Zoya made a brief stop. She visited a retail outlet with a DVD rental service to return a movie. During the examination of the scene and the study of the circumstances, the investigative team planned to interrogate individuals who might have been witnesses during the time Zoya was in the vicinity of the specified location. Interacting with a wide range of people led to the identification of two key witnesses. One of them, Lester Clark, working in a nearby tattoo parlor, shared that he went out for cigarettes around 16:45 and noticed a girl at the rental point. Sometime later, he witnessed her returning to the parking lot and approaching a white minivan. As she tried to open the door, a man approached her, took the initiative, exchanged a few words with her, after which she moved to the passenger seat and he took the driver's seat, and the vehicle left the parking lot. Lester confirmed that it was indeed Zoya in the photos shown to him. Despite noticing tension in their interaction, Lester did not consider it significant, assuming the situation did not bear signs of an explicit threat. The eyewitness provided law enforcement with a description of the man: dark-skinned, not tall, but visibly muscular. Lester, who was at a considerable distance, was unable to get a detailed look at the suspect's face. In the evening, at dusk, he again observed the same man walking toward the store. Another key eyewitness was Gary Whitman, who told a similar story. Being homeless, he was across the parking lot at the time of the incident. At 4:45 p.m., Gary observed a young woman approach a white minivan, and a man appeared right behind her and offered her a seat in the car, then pulled an object out of his pocket and showed it to the woman. This forced her into the passenger seat, and the man took the driver's seat and they drove off. Gary described the suspect in a similar manner and added that the man's actions seemed extremely suspicious to him, prompting him to ask the store to call police. However, it is unclear whether his request was honored, as investigative records do not contain any record of such a call. While investigators were busy interviewing witnesses, experts came to several important conclusions. A specialist pathologist found traces of semen during a detailed examination of the body, but the amount was so small that a comprehensive DNA analysis was not possible. Nevertheless, it confirmed that the perpetrator had sexually assaulted the victim before taking her life. During an examination of the car belonging to the deceased, forensic investigators found no foreign fingerprints, neither on the door handles nor on the steering wheel. According to evidence, the suspect may have driven Zoe away from the store's parking lot in her minivan himself, which was an unexpected turnaround for the investigation. At the same time, detectives did not rule out the theory that the perpetrator may have carefully removed his fingerprints from surfaces inside the vehicle after the crime was committed. Several hairs were found on Zoe's body, but experts were unable to extract a full DNA sample due to their small size. However, when they examined a knife found near the crime scene, they got a breakthrough. A DNA sample was found on the blade, which was immediately uploaded to the FBI database. The police got a match, and the sample belonged to 34-year-old Antonio Cochran. The man had a pretty impressive criminal history dating back to his teenage years. He had been arrested for theft, assault, and breaking into other people's homes. He also had several other suspected felonies. A year before this event in 2014, his partner's 17-year-old daughter accused Antonio of rape. According to the girl, the man offered to take her somewhere, but once she was in his car, Antonio drove her into the woods, where he threatened to kill her if she tried to escape. He then committed violence with her, but the trial could not find enough evidence of his guilt. Therefore, Antonio was released. When his DNA matched the sample on the knife, the police put out a wanted notice and the man was soon arrested. During the interrogations with inspectors, Antonio categorically denied any involvement in the crime, prompting investigators to focus on finding additional evidence. As a first step, specialists took his DNA samples, aiming to match them with the DNA found on the corpse in the form of hairs and biological traces. Since the amount of traces found was insufficient to obtain a complete genetic profile, experts used a method that allowed for an approximate match, ruling out a complete match with Antonio's DNA but not providing a definitive verdict. Comparing the incomplete genetic profiles with the suspect's sample, they stated that a complete exclusion of similarity was impossible. Simultaneously analyzing Antonio's mobile phone, detectives discovered a series of messages indicating his potentially troubled state on the day of the murder. One text sent at 1:48 a.m. before Zoya's death was addressed to a neighbor with a notification of his imminent departure, suggesting that the neighbor would not see him again. Another message sent at 2:07 p.m. the same day to an ex-girlfriend mentioned the death of his stepmother, to whom he was as close as a real mother. The man shared that she had died right before his eyes, and he was struggling to cope with this loss. Within the next hour, Antonio sent messages to another woman twice, saying he had spent the whole night in tears, wandering around the city and consuming alcohol. These were his last words before Zoya's demise. That evening, at 9:30 p.m., he wrote to a friend, expressing his despair and confusion about what to do next, mentioning numerous troubles that had recently clouded his life. The next day, he wrote to a former lover, predicting the end of his life and foretelling that she would soon find out everything. Examining his search queries, investigators found more than 30 visits to news sites in the crime news section, 5 of which were related to Zoya's murder. Although prior to these events, he rarely showed interest in the news, finding only one query related to criminal gang activity. Another clue was related to his mobile device. Requesting data on geolocation from the cellular operator, detectives established that at 4:34 p.m., his phone connected to the network in the area where the store Zoya was at was located. However, this information was not sufficient to categorize it as substantial evidence. Cell tower data indicated that the accused's mobile phone could have been within several kilometers of Zoya's location, which, although not direct evidence, suggested that Antonio might have arrived in the area shortly before Zoya left the parking lot. His residence was located at a significant distance, and his phone had connected to the network through a different nearby tower during the day. It was also established that 3 days before the incident, he had started a job at a nearby grocery store, but did not show up for work on Monday after the incident without explaining his absence. Although the police managed to build a comprehensive array of circumstantial evidence, the direct evidence of Antonio's guilt remained solely the DNA found on the knife handle, which in itself might have been insufficient for a conviction. The presence of DNA on an item does not irrefutably prove the commission of a murder. Antonio could have used the knife for other purposes, after which someone else used it as the murder weapon. The lack of additional evidence led the investigation to decide to move the case to court for further examination. According to the prosecution's version, the sequence of events unfolded as follows. Zoya, heading to her car in the parking lot, encountered Antonio. Approaching her, he pulled out a knife from his pocket and, under threat, forced her into the car, after which he took the driver's seat. The prosecution referred to messages sent by the suspect before the crime, stating that he was going through difficult times due to the loss of a close person and alcohol consumption. From this, investigators concluded that Antonio abducted the girl with the intention of committing violence against her, choosing Zoya not deliberately, but due to her accidental presence in the parking lot. Then he drove her to a stream in a secluded area surrounded by trees, where it was impossible to observe the events. There, he forced the victim out of the car, committed violent acts against her, and inflicted 6 knife wounds to the neck area. Afterward, Antonio returned to the car and attempted to drown it in the stream, likely in an attempt to eliminate evidence inside the vehicle. However, the car did not completely submerge, theoretically allowing Antonio to remove his fingerprints from the steering wheel and door handles before fleeing the scene. Based on the first witness's statements, an individual resembling Antonio was seen walking back to the parking lot at the store that evening. The defense emphasized that most of the evidence could hardly even be considered circumstantial. For example, the partial DNA match from the hair and biological traces only showed that Antonio could not be conclusively ruled out as having those samples, but it did not confirm his direct connection to them. Regarding the DNA on the knife, the defense focused on the fact that the presence of DNA does not confirm the act of murder. They argued that Antonio could have interacted with the knife in a different situation. Before working at the store, he cleaned at a movie theater, where, he claimed, he sometimes had to pick up items left behind by patrons, including knives. However, this version could not be confirmed. Additionally, for another person to take the knife from the movie theater and commit the murder with it while not removing Antonio's DNA from the handle would require a complex task of preserving genetic material, which seemed unlikely. The defense sought to challenge the credibility of testimony from a vagrant named Gary, who had previously been issued a warrant for violating the terms of his parole. The lawyers aimed to discredit his testimony by pointing to the witness's legal issues, while the prosecution countered, arguing that Gary's willingness to engage with law enforcement, despite the existing warrant, testified to his sincere desire to aid the investigation. Gary himself emphasized that his actions were motivated by a desire to do the right thing, fully aware of the potential consequences for himself. Antonio's defenders also attempted to prove that at the time of the crime, their client was elsewhere, helping a friend, but they failed to present convincing evidence to support this alibi. Initially, the prosecution pushed for the death penalty for Antonio, but difficulties with the evidence base forced them to abandon this idea during the trial. After lengthy deliberations, the jury reached a verdict, finding Antonio guilty of murder and sentencing him to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Zoya's parents expressed their gratitude to the investigators and all participants in the process, as they were able to secure punishment for the criminal. Her father also shared that he had always told his children about the potential dangers that this world might present. The man made every effort to protect them, but his eldest daughter was abducted just a few hundred meters from home, and he was powerless to prevent it. A young woman went out to celebrate New Year's Eve and suddenly disappeared. The ensuing police investigation uncovered numerous alarming pieces of evidence, but it took 35 years to unravel the mystery of the truth. The case took an unexpected turn, and the circumstances of her disappearance on that fateful New Year's Eve were finally revealed to all. Toni McKinley was born on January 25, 1961, in Milton, Florida, USA. She grew up in a harmonious family and was closely bonded with her older sister. The girls enjoyed walking, skateboarding, and visiting the local bowling club. After finishing school, Toni decided to move to Pensacola, located about 25 miles from her home, in search of her calling in the medical field. She chose a career as a medical transcriptionist, a profession that required specialized courses without the need for a medical degree. Her cousin Vanita decided to join Toni, and they rented an apartment together to save money. Soon after moving, Toni met a young man named Tim with whom she began a relationship. Sometime after they started living together, in 1983, a boy named Timothy was born to their family, and Toni experienced the joy of motherhood. However, her relationship with Tim was far from ideal. Frequent conflicts overshadowed the couple's life, and about a year after the child's birth, they decided to separate. By the end of 1984, Toni temporarily moved in with her cousin, who by that time had her own family with a husband and 2 children. Toni planned to find suitable accommodation and move there as soon as possible. On December 31st, Toni, Vanita, and the latter's husband decided to celebrate the new year at a local bar where festive events were planned. Leaving their children at a daycare that was open until late at night, they went out to welcome 1985. At the bar, they spent a joyful evening enjoying conversations, dancing, and laughter among friends and acquaintances. When the clock struck midnight, Vanita and her husband began to prepare to go home since the daycare closed at 1 a.m., and they needed to pick up their children. Meanwhile, Toni decided to stay at the bar longer, appreciating the rare opportunity to relax from work and caring for her son, which had fully occupied her for the last 2 years. This evening was a unique chance for her to enjoy the moment without any obligations. Toni asked her sister to pick up her boy from the daycare, and she agreed without hesitation since they needed to pick up their own children, and they lived together, simplifying the task. Before leaving, Vanita inquired about how Toni planned to get home, since they had arrived in Vanita's car. Toni confidently replied that she would easily find company for the ride back, considering the many acquaintances at the bar. On the morning of January 1st, waking up, Vanita was shocked to find Toni not at home. Her absence seemed strange, as she should have returned long ago. Initially thinking Toni might have stayed the night with friends, Vanita was not overly concerned. However, the situation quickly changed when an anxious mother-in-law arrived at their home with the shocking news: Toni had been found dead. Last night, around 3 in the morning, a woman from Pensacola and her daughter went to an emergency veterinary clinic due to their dog's urgent health issues. Leaving their residential area, the daughter noticed something unusual on the side of the road, resembling a mannequin, and pointed it out to her mother. Deciding to take a closer look, the woman was horrified to discover it was a human body. She immediately returned home and called the police. Upon arrival at the specified location, police found the body of a young woman in a vacant lot near the road. Her condition suggested violence. Her tights had been pulled down, her dress lifted, and her shoes were missing. A blue towel with suspicious stains resembling blood was found close to her. Identifying the deceased didn't take long. It was 20-year-old Toni McKinley. Her personal items, shoes, and a purse with documents were found near the scene. The body was sent for examination, and investigators continued to survey the area. The inspection suggested that the crime occurred elsewhere, as no blood was found near the body, except for the stains on the towel. Tracks on the ground indicated that the body had been moved from the road to the side. Important clues were found on the towel and the victim's body. Several strands of red and pubic hair, as well as dog fur, suggesting both types of hair could belong to the perpetrator, who might have owned a dog. Medical experts concluded that Tanya died from strangulation, though she also suffered a severe head injury from a heavy object. Furthermore, it was determined that the victim had been sexually assaulted before her death. Biological material from the attacker was retrieved from Tanya's body, but at that time, DNA analysis technology had not yet been widely applied in forensics. Experts could only determine that the criminal had type O blood. Despite having this information, it was insufficient to direct the investigation on the right path to finding the killer. Consequently, detectives began compiling a list of potential suspects, paying special attention to Tim, the deceased's former partner. Interviews with Tanya's friends and relatives revealed issues in their relationship, persisting both before and after the birth of their son. Tanya's decision to end these ties met resistance from Tim, who was unwilling to part and continued trying to win her back, regularly calling and showing up at her house, demonstrating his inability to accept the breakup. This led investigators to speculate that on New Year's Eve, Tim might have followed Tanya to the bar, where a conflict between them ensued, ending in tragedy. Tim was brought in for questioning, but denied any involvement in the crime and agreed to provide hair samples for analysis. Although DNA analysis of Tim's hair samples was not possible, experts could conduct microscopic comparison, which in theory could confirm their match with those found at the crime scene. However, Tim's hair samples clearly did not match those found on the victim's body and towel, eliminating him from the list of suspects at that time. Investigators shifted their focus to questioning patrons of the bar present during the New Year's Eve celebration. They asked Vanita about any unusual or aggressive behavior towards Tony, but according to her, the evening passed without incident. However, it soon emerged that after breaking up with Tim, Tony had briefly dated Kurt, the bartender at the establishment, where she celebrated New Year's Eve, and he was working that night. When speaking with Kurt, he denied any involvement in the crime, claiming he went to a New Year's party with friends after work. Upon questioning these friends, an interesting conclusion was reached. They confirmed Kurt's presence at the party, providing him with an alibi. However, his arrival at the party was not immediately after finishing his shift at the bar. Gathering information from all parties, the police concluded that Kurt could have had enough time to commit the crime. Information obtained from bar guests indicated that Tony was last seen alive around 1:15 a.m., and there were no witnesses to her departure. Additionally, upon questioning residents of the area where the body was found, one family mentioned they had driven past the location around 2 a.m. and did not notice the body, allowing for the deduction that the murder occurred within a little over an hour and a half from the last time Tony was seen in public. It was during this time frame that Kurt had no alibi. Kurt agreed to undergo a polygraph test, which yielded inconclusive results. The polygraph expert determined that answers to some questions were unreliable. However, soon after, blood analysis results from Kurt revealed that his blood type did not match the semen sample from the criminal. Consequently, Kurt was ruled out as a suspect, and the police continued their search for the person responsible for the crime. All their efforts were in vain as there were no means to analyze DNA from the semen sample, and no other significant evidence or testimonies could be found. The case quickly hit a dead end. The only assumption investigators were almost certain of was that the perpetrator likely lived in the area where the body was found, a location remote from main roads and on the fringe of extensive private developments. Police deemed it unlikely that a criminal unfamiliar with the area would choose to transport the body to such a location without knowing where he was headed. The investigation of the case ceased and remained stagnant for many years. Timothy, who was only 18 months old at the time of his mother's death, was raised by his father with support from Tony's family. They decided to conceal the true circumstances of his mother's death from him, later telling him that she died in a car accident. This version of events persisted until he turned 14. On the eve of Christmas, in an attempt to discover what surprise his father had prepared for him, Timothy climbed into his closet looking for the present. However, instead of the expected surprise, he found something far more somber. Inside, a letter was found, written by his father, and addressed to the famous television host Montel Williams. In the letter, the father asked the TV host to shed light on the unsolved murder case of Tony, hoping that media attention would aid in advancing the investigation. Tim detailed all the circumstances of the crime in the letter, and it was through this that his son first learned about the real events surrounding his mother's death. In the early 2000s, the police department decided to reopen the investigation into Tony's case, banking on advances in DNA analysis technology to lead them to the killer. Investigators sent the available evidence for examination, where it was determined that the blood on the blue towel found near the body belonged to an unknown man. His DNA profile was entered into the FBI database, but no matches were found. The case once again went cold, until it was reopened in 2015, 30 years after the crime was committed. Since the killer's DNA had not been found in the FBI database, detectives decided to use a new approach that allowed searching for not only full matches, but also partial DNA matches. They speculated that the database might contain relatives of the criminal, which could aid in identifying the culprit. The investigation led them to a man whose data had been entered into the FBI database, whose DNA showed limited similarity to the material belonging to Tony's presumed killer. Although the match was not perfect, investigators decided to delve deeper into his familial connections and sought help from the relatives of the detainee. The relatives provided their DNA samples for analysis, but the results, received in 2018, did not bring the anticipated breakthrough. Around the same time, a journalist named Tony Adame took an interest in the case. Although criminal events were not his specialty, the mysterious and unsolved murder of Tony McKinley sparked his desire to contribute to the investigation. He reached out to the detectives leading the case, hoping to aid in its resolution. The investigators were skeptical of his offer, considering his lack of experience in forensics. However, with no new leads or evidence at the time, they decided involving the journalist could do no harm. Thus, Adame essentially became part of the investigative team and began to maintain contact with Tony's family. Recognizing his genuine interest and dedication to the case, investigators appreciated the journalist's efforts to draw public attention to the investigation through coverage in well-known media outlets. This approach not only increased awareness about the case, but also injected fresh momentum into the years-long investigation, possibly accelerating its resolution. In 2019, a year after the journalist joined the case, detectives decided to search again for the criminal's relatives, this time collaborating with Parabon, a company specializing in genetic genealogy. The previous search was limited to the FBI database, which includes DNA samples from criminals. Unlike this, Parabon worked with large-scale, publicly accessible genetic databases, which anyone interested in exploring their genealogical tree or searching for relatives could access. Experts from the company began a meticulous analysis and soon identified potential distant relatives of the killer, initiating a methodical investigation of their genealogies. The goal was to establish connections between families and identify a person fitting the suspect's profile. A man who, in 1985, was old enough to commit the crime and lived in the relevant region. The task before the specialist was extremely challenging, and it took almost an entire year to resolve. By February 2020, the analysis led to 57-year-old Daniel Wells, who lived in the correct city at the time of the crime. Further investigation revealed that Wells had a history with the law. He was arrested for assault in the late 80s and later for exhibitionism. In 2020, Daniel continued to live in Pensacola, working as a carpenter, and had a family. To confirm his involvement in the crime, investigators needed a sample of his DNA to compare with the material found at the murder scene. Proceeding with caution and fearing that Wells might attempt to flee if he became aware of the suspicions against him, the police began surveillance. Soon, an opportunity arose to collect a DNA sample. Wells discarded a cigarette out of his car window on his way to work. Investigators promptly collected the cigarette butt and sent it for analysis in the laboratory. Experts successfully extracted DNA from the saliva on the cigarette filter and compared it to the DNA found at the murder scene of Tony. The analysis results showed a perfect match. After 35 years since the crime was committed, the police were finally able to identify the perpetrator, who was arrested the same day. With DNA analysis results at their disposal, investigators aimed to obtain a confession from the suspect. To preserve the element of surprise, they decided to act cautiously, not revealing the full extent of the evidence to Daniel at once. As a first step, they asked patrol officers to stop his car for a document check. Then detectives approached the stop location and informed Daniel of the need to visit the police station, without specifying the reason for the call. During the interrogation, investigators carefully approached the subject of Tony's murder, gradually asking questions about his whereabouts that night. Daniel denied meeting the girl and any involvement in the crime, but his agitation grew with each question from the detectives. After revealing the information about his DNA matching the sample from the crime scene, his attempts to deny guilt became increasingly unconvincing. Investigators emphasized the incontrovertibility of the DNA evidence and pointed out that there was no chance of avoiding responsibility. His only way out was to mitigate the consequences for himself by confessing to the crime. At a certain point, Daniel began to speak candidly. Initially, he tried to explain his DNA presence on Tony by suggesting they might have known each other and had a close relationship. However, investigators quickly refuted this argument, insisting on getting the true version of events. Eventually, Daniel confessed to killing Tony that New Year's night, although his story continued to raise questions among the detectives. The man recounted that he met Tony at the bar where she was looking for someone to drive her home. Daniel offered his help and they left in his car. According to him, they went to his place where they drank and, by mutual consent, engaged in an intimate relationship. A conflict then erupted between them, the reasons for which he claimed not to remember. The situation escalated to the extent that Daniel grabbed a heavy wooden cutting board and struck Tony on the head in a fit of anger. Realizing the girl was dead, he panicked. Daniel loaded Tony's body into his car and drove it to the location where it was later found, leaving the body there. On his way back, he disposed of her personal belongings and returned home. During the interrogation, he was also questioned about the origin of dog hairs found on the victim's clothing and the towel. He explained that his neighbor had a black Labrador and the hairs were of the same color. Daniel's account seemed as though he was trying to minimize his guilt in the incident. It was difficult to believe in the voluntary, intimate relations between Tony and Daniel, considering that, by his account, a conflict erupted just a few minutes after it began, which ended in the girl's death. Daniel claimed that Tony died from a blow to the head, but medical experts determined strangulation as the cause of death. It seemed more likely that Daniel attempted to assault Tony, to which she resisted. After hitting her on the head and realizing she was still alive, he decided to strangle her. Despite the contradictions in his story with the facts, the presence of a confession allowed the police to arrest Daniel and take him into custody on murder charges. Immediately after obtaining the confession, investigators contacted Tony's relatives, including her son, to share the news of the case's resolution. Timothy could not hide his emotions and, with tears in his eyes, expressed gratitude to the police for finding the criminal responsible for his mother's death. However, Daniel was not destined to stand trial and start serving his sentence for the crime committed. Just 2 weeks after his arrest, Daniel was found dead in his cell. A forensic examination confirmed that he committed suicide. Tony's family felt disappointed that the murderer was able to avoid a long imprisonment. Nevertheless, despite these circumstances, they found consolation in the realization that, after 35 years of investigation, their loved one's murder was finally solved. After returning home, the girl entered her residence and seemed to vanish into thin air, leaving behind a mystery. The investigative team immediately took on the case and soon stumbled upon a series of horrifying circumstances. Penetrating through the fog of mysteries, they managed to uncover a shocking truth that appalled and outraged everyone following the developments. Rachel Anderson was born on January 28, 1994, in the cozy American town of Warren, Ohio, where she was the eldest in her family. With the arrival of her younger brother, she took on the role of a helper to her parents in his upbringing. During her school years, Rachel became an active participant in sports and cultural activities, playing for football and volleyball teams, as well as being involved in a music group. By the time she graduated from high school, she had decided on her future profession, to become a funeral home director. Rachel was distinguished by her deep compassion and responsiveness to the pain of others, striving to support those in need. That's why she decided her calling was to assist the bereaved in organizing farewells and funeral ceremonies. In pursuit of a profession that would allow her to help people during difficult moments of their lives, Rachel enrolled in a university located at a surprisingly convenient half-hour drive from her childhood home. There, she didn't just emerge as a student, but as one of the most promising graduates, thanks to her outstanding academic achievements and leadership qualities. After successfully completing her university education, Rachel continued her educational journey, enrolling in a specialized college in Cincinnati, which became another step toward her professional dream. In 2017, armed with knowledge and new skills, she moved to Columbus, where her career path began to develop rapidly. Thanks to her perseverance in education, Rachel not only found a job at a funeral bureau but also immediately began an internship where she demonstrated her diligence, professionalism, and deep understanding of the importance of her work every day. Her hard work and pursuit of excellence did not go unnoticed by the management, which quickly concluded the necessity of offering her a permanent position after the internship ended. Rachel, in turn, became deeply attached to her place of work and even expressed a desire to spend her entire career there, finding a special meaning in assisting people during such a difficult period of their lives. Her life in the new city began with renting an apartment in a cozy suburb where she could enjoy peace and solitude while preparing to complete her internship and begin her full-fledged professional activities. Aside from her career plans, Rachel eagerly anticipated the upcoming 24th birthday, which was to occur on January 28, 2018. Her younger brother John, always close by and supportive of her endeavors, decided to give his sister an unforgettable celebration. He organized a party at his friend's house, inviting several mutual acquaintances to jointly celebrate this important day. John arrived in Columbus the day before the event and stayed with Rachel to prepare for the celebration together. Due to her busy work schedule that day, Rachel entrusted her brother with her main apartment key. The only spare key was with Rachel's friend in case of any unforeseen circumstances, so the girl could only enter her home if her brother let her in. In their quest to gather all their friends for a joint celebration, Rachel and her brother decided that the best solution would be to organize a party on the eve of her birthday, that is, on the evening of January 27th. After finishing her workday, Rachel headed to her friend's house, where a warm and friendly atmosphere awaited her, filled with laughter, music, and joyous moments. In honor of reaching her 24th year, the evening turned into a bright and unforgettable event that lasted until late into the night. Considering the late hour, Rachel and her brother decided to stay overnight at their friend's place. The next morning, after returning to her apartment, Rachel's brother soon headed back home. However, once he arrived in his city, he was astonished to find that he had forgotten to return the apartment keys to Rachel. After a phone conversation with his sister, it became clear that Rachel could use a spare key, which was with a friend. However, the friend had left the key with the couple with whom they celebrated the birthday. Learning that the owners had gone to another city and would not return until the evening, Rachel decided to pick up the key after work. Finishing her shift around 6:30 p.m., she collected the key, bid farewell to her friends, and headed home. On her way, Rachel called her mom, and they spent about 10 minutes chatting, sharing news and plans for the near future. It was expected that Rachel would appear at work the next day, as she was known for her dedication and enthusiasm. She never arrived late, often even arriving earlier than scheduled. However, to the surprise of her colleagues and management, Rachel did not show up for work, marking a strange deviation from her usual behavior and causing concern among those who knew her. In the middle of the day, concerned about Rachel's absence from work, her manager decided to send one of the colleagues to her place of residence to ensure her well-being. Considering that the girl had recently celebrated her birthday, there was speculation that she might have partied too hard and failed to wake up in time. However, preferring to err on the side of caution, the management decided to personally check on Rachel's condition. Upon arrival, the colleague spent several minutes knocking on Rachel's apartment door, but no response followed. At that moment, his attention was drawn to the housing complex's administrator, to whom he turned with a request to open the door. However, he was refused, as the administrator did not have the authority to intervene without the tenant's consent or a court order. Unable to gain access to the apartment, the colleague decided to take a look through the living room window, where an unexpected scene unfolded before him. A candle was burning on the table. This fact seemed extremely odd, as no one responded to his knocking. It raised the assumption that Rachel might have accidentally left the candle burning and left. With this in mind, he decided to call the police, who quickly dispatched an officer to the scene. Meanwhile, the housing complex's manager revealed a detail that the lease agreement for the apartment listed the name of Rachel's ex-boyfriend instead of hers. It turned out that after moving to Columbus, Rachel and her boyfriend had rented the apartment together. But after their breakup, the contract remained in his name. Accordingly, permission to enter the apartment had to be obtained specifically from him. The manager immediately contacted Rachel's ex-boyfriend, listed in the agreement, and he consented to entry into the apartment. After this, the administrator opened the door with a service key and entered to investigate the circumstances. Inside the apartment, the setting appeared ordinary, except for a single burning candle, which was the only unusual element in the entire place. The absence of any signs of violence, struggle, or blood did not raise suspicions with the arriving police officer. It seemed as though Rachel had just left and was about to return home at any moment. After a brief inspection, the police officer, along with Rachel's colleague, left the apartment, and the manager locked the door behind them with a key. Rachel's friend Jonathan, with whom she had celebrated her birthday, was soon informed of the incident. Rachel's boss had called him, reporting her absence from work and her home. Concerned by such news, Jonathan immediately headed to her residence, but upon arrival, he could not find Rachel. Despite several minutes of knocking on the door and attempting to look through the window, there was no response. Noticing Rachel's car in the parking lot, he observed it was not in its usual spot in front of the house, but around the corner, which was unusual for the organized parking spaces of such complexes. However, the presence of the car indicated that Rachel could not have gone far, which only heightened his concern. At a certain moment, Jonathan noticed a passing police patrol car and signaled to the officers. They stopped, and he shared his concerns with them. Consequently, the police called the housing complex's manager, who, for the second time that day, opened Rachel's apartment door to allow further investigation. Jonathan immediately went upstairs while the police inspected the living room on the first floor. As soon as he crossed the threshold of the upper floor, his piercing scream alarmed the officers, prompting them to rush to his aid. In the closet of Rachel's bedroom, they found her body. She was partially wrapped in a blanket, and her head was covered with a shirt. Additionally, another piece of clothing was tightly wrapped around the girl's neck, its end tied to the closet handle from the inside. Forensic experts were called to the scene and, after a thorough inspection of the apartment, found no clear signs of forced entry or struggle, except for the closet where the body was located. Everything else in the apartment looked absolutely normal. However, the police noticed Rachel's bag lying on the living room floor. Inside the bag, detectives found a fast food restaurant receipt and a partially uneaten dinner on the table in the room, with the date and time on the receipt indicating the evening before the discovery, 1932. The investigation concluded that the attack on Rachel occurred shortly after she returned home and began to have dinner. Detectives also noted the absence of any money and bank cards in the house, suggesting that the criminal might have taken them. During a detailed inspection of the bedroom, forensic experts discovered a large, presumably blood-stained spot on the carpet by the bed, serving as additional evidence of a brutal crime. During further investigation, as detectives carefully removed Rachel's body from the closet and removed the blanket, they encountered a series of shocking findings. The victim was nearly devoid of clothing, except for the piece wrapped around her neck. Beneath it, they discovered a tightly fastened wire stretching from the room to the closet. Furthermore, Rachel's hands and feet were securely tied with rags, and a piece of cloth was found in her mouth. Under her body on the floor lay her underwear. The medical examination revealed that Rachel had sustained a knife wound to her neck, and her death resulted from strangulation with a wire. Additionally, it was discovered that the victim had been sexually assaulted, and a DNA sample from the assailant was collected and sent to a lab for identification. While forensic experts meticulously searched for clues both in Rachel's apartment and her car, investigators conducted interviews with her relatives and friends. Rachel's brother, who arrived in Columbus immediately after being notified of the incident, shared information about his sister's last days, including his suspicions about a possible perpetrator. Particular attention was paid to the brother's account of Jonathan, the friend who first discovered Rachel's body. Weeks before the tragedy, Rachel had shared her observations about Jonathan's unusual behavior with her brother. According to her, during gatherings with friends, Jonathan began paying her excessive attention, which she found strange given his marital status. Rachel speculated that his actions could be motivated by romantic feelings, which alarmed her considering his family status. Rachel expressed concern about Jonathan, confessing that his behavior had started to worry her. Her brother mentioned that after their conversation on this topic, she never revisited her concerns, and a few weeks later, they cheerfully celebrated her birthday at the home of Jonathan and his wife. Additionally, Rachel mentioned to her brother about the peculiar behavior of one of the neighbors in the residential complex, without delving into details or specifying what exactly caused her concern. After speaking with Rachel's brother, detectives decided to meet with Jonathan, who denied having romantic feelings for Rachel and any involvement in her death. He claimed to have spent that evening with his wife, who confirmed his alibi. Despite his statements, investigators continued to consider him among the possible suspects, especially since he was the first to head to Rachel's bedroom and touch the closet door and Rachel herself. According to Jonathan, he did not realize she was dead immediately and attempted to help her. Investigators also met with Rachel's ex-boyfriend, who still had a key to her apartment. However, he provided an alibi, stating he was in another city at the time of the crime. As a result, the police had to search for additional clues and leads to advance the investigation of this mysterious murder. Realizing that the criminal likely stole Rachel's bank cards, investigators contacted her financial institution to obtain information about the latest transactions on her account. Analyzing the banking data, they discovered that on January 28th at 9:43 p.m., Rachel's bank card was used to withdraw cash from an ATM located at a grocery store. The police suspected that by that time, Rachel might have already been deceased, which prompted them to immediately visit the specified store to review the surveillance footage. The recordings showed Rachel's car approaching the store, but instead of her, an unknown man exited from the passenger side. He approached the ATM, performed the withdrawal, and returned to the car. The video quality allowed for a partial view of the suspect's face, but the available footage was insufficient for a precise identification of this person's identity. However, investigators managed to capture an interesting moment. The video showed that someone else was sitting in the driver's seat of the car, but only their hand was caught on camera. That same night and over the following few days, cash withdrawals were made from Rachel's bank card at various locations around the city. Each time, an unknown man exited her car, approached the ATM, completed the transaction, and returned to the vehicle. These sequential cash withdrawals across different parts of the city painted a picture of the perpetrator's calculated actions for the investigators. Starting their investigation at the grocery store where cash was withdrawn using Rachel's card, the police printed and showed the store clerk a photo of the suspect caught on video. To the investigators' surprise, the clerk not only recognized the man in the photo, but was also able to name him. He was Anthony, a homeless man frequently seen in the store's parking lot. Given Anthony's lack of a permanent residence, the officers decided to wait for his reappearance at the store and asked the clerk to immediately notify them upon seeing Anthony. Soon, on February 8th, the clerk contacted the police, reporting Anthony's arrival at the parking lot, and he was promptly arrested. During the interrogation about the source of Rachel's bank card, Anthony told the detectives an unusual story. On the evening of January 28th, while near the store, he was approached by a stranger who had just exited the store. The stranger claimed he needed help. He had just broken up with his girlfriend, who was now attempting to steal his money. He asked Anthony to withdraw cash from his ex-girlfriend's card, provided the PIN, and promised to pay for Anthony's night in a nice hotel as a token of gratitude. Agreeing to the proposal, Anthony took the card and headed to the ATM inside the store. The stranger requested him to withdraw $2,000, but the ATM only dispensed $40. After the first unsuccessful attempt to withdraw a significant amount, the stranger drove Anthony to various locations in the city, stopping at different ATMs where Anthony continued to withdraw money in small amounts. Eventually, they managed to withdraw a total of $400, which they also used to buy cigarettes and other inexpensive items. After these adventures, the man left Anthony near the store and disappeared. Since then, the homeless man had not seen the mysterious stranger again. Anthony was adamant about his version of the events, and the police considered the possibility of his sincerity, supported by video recordings showing another person driving Rachel's car, consistent with Anthony's description. Anthony provided the investigators with a description of the stranger: a medium height, black man with short hair and a distinctive Southern accent. After speaking with Anthony, officers intensified their efforts to collect surveillance footage from the ATMs used for transactions on Rachel's card, and soon they found a new lead. One of the cameras captured a man who tried to conceal his face with his hands. However, the investigators' attention was drawn to another detail in the video. A woman was present in the car the suspect arrived in. Further recordings showed that sometimes she accompanied the man to the ATM, and at other times she acted alone, also using Rachel's card. Considering that Anthony conducted transactions with the card only on January 28th, and the withdrawals continued in the subsequent days, detectives concluded that the perpetrator was using Rachel's bank card in collaboration with a woman, whether she was his girlfriend or merely an acquaintance. The police found footage that clearly showed the face of the identified woman and tried to find out her identity. They soon succeeded. Someone identified her and told investigators that she was Deborah Pardon. After learning her address, investigators went to speak with her. Once the woman was told that they had evidence of her use of the murdered victim's bank card, she immediately started talking. Deborah stated that her brother had given her the card, saying it belonged to his girlfriend. Therefore, the sister assumed that the girlfriend had authorized her brother to use the card. Detectives also discovered that Deborah was the owner of the vehicle that was caught on surveillance video with the suspect inside. He turned out to be a 54-year-old man named Anthony Pardon, who is Deborah's brother. When the police checked his name, a girl vanished from her own bedroom under peculiar circumstances. Police immediately began their search and soon encountered a series of unexpected twists that no one could have anticipated. Ultimately, detectives were able to uncover the truth about her fate. However, this revelation raised even more unsettling questions. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. After her parents divorced when she was young, she moved with her mother to the small town of Stella in Missouri. Her mother, Colin, met a man named David, and they got married. Colin had several children from a previous marriage, and soon after the wedding, she and David had a daughter. In total, Rowan had 2 sisters and 2 brothers, with whom she was very close. She spent a lot of time outdoors biking around her town, and she loved to swim and draw. Additionally, Rowan enjoyed spending time at her local church's Sunday school, always one of the first to enthusiastically assist other children who were struggling with their tasks. In November 2007, the 9-year-old 4th grader often found herself alone. Her mother worked night shifts at a store, while her stepfather took care of the farm during the day. This situation made the girl independent from an early age. On November 2nd, following her usual routine, she stayed home alone. Her mother went to work, and her stepfather had not yet returned from the farm. The next morning, around 9 a.m., Callan returned from her night shift and checked Rowan's room, but she was not there. Upon asking her husband about their daughter's whereabouts, she learned that Rowan had asked for permission to spend the night at a friend's house, which was granted without specifying the friend's name. Given the small size of their town, her stepfather saw no risk in this. Nevertheless, Callan was filled with worry. She decided to visit all of Rowan's friends, which did not take long due to the town's small size. However, when all the girls claimed they hadn't seen Rowan and that she hadn't stayed over, Callan's alarm grew. After unsuccessful attempts to find her daughter by searching the entire town, Callan returned home and informed her husband that Rowan was missing. Following her daughter's disappearance, Callan insisted that David contact the authorities and report the incident. However, he convinced her that Rowan was fine and would return soon. The woman waited several hours, but when her daughter did not appear, she decided to call the police herself by dialing 911. The sheriff immediately began a search operation, starting by visiting their home to meet with David, the last person to see Rowan. David explained that on that evening, while he was working on the farm with a colleague, Christopher, another acquaintance, Nathan, stopped by. They all decided to go to David's home to drink and play pool. They picked up some alcohol and spent a few hours at home. As it got dark, Christopher and Nathan decided to go to a nearby town to Christopher's residential trailer, and David, after some hesitation, joined them. Before leaving, he checked that Rowan was asleep and then left with his friends. They stopped for more alcohol and continued the evening at Christopher's trailer. After a while, David decided to head home and asked Nathan to drive him. Choosing to avoid main roads and driven by the desire to stay out of sight of the police due to being intoxicated, Nathan took him home via back roads. Upon arriving home, David immediately went to sleep. but was soon woken by Rowan, who wanted to spend the night at a friend's house. Without hesitation, David consented and fell back asleep. The police were skeptical of this narrative, particularly questioning how a 9-year-old girl would decide to go to a friend's house in the middle of the night, and why the stepfather allowed this without even asking for the friend's name. The sheriff considered the possibility that David might be hiding something or was involved in Rowan's disappearance, though there was no concrete evidence to support this theory. That same day, police and residents of the town and its surroundings mobilized for a search, which continued into the late night. Given that Stella was a small town with only about 150 residents, news of Rowan's disappearance quickly spread among the local population. In a community where children used to freely roam the streets, the disappearance of one of their own caused shock and panic. Not finding the girl on the first day of searching, the police went to the neighboring town to Christopher, who confirmed David's version. Christopher also added that he had not had contact with his friend since that evening and was unaware of Rowan's disappearance. The same day, the police force was significantly bolstered by additional volunteers. Yet no success in finding Rowan or any clues to her whereabouts was achieved. The next morning, FBI agents joined the investigation. While local police surveyed the town and adjacent areas, FBI agents focused on the possibility of an abduction, expressing doubts about the credibility of Rowan's stepfather's account. His narrative raised questions, and confirmation of his words from the friends the girl supposedly could have visited was not obtained. Further interactions with David revealed inconsistencies and changes in his story, which only strengthened their suspicions. David provided conflicting information about the time he was away from home on the night of the disappearance, and at times suggested that Rowan could have left the house without his permission or knowledge. Additionally, FBI agents discovered that David had asked to borrow his mother's car on the night of the disappearance, a detail he initially did not share with the police. As a result, it was decided to seize and inspect both the mother's car and David's personal pickup truck. Despite a thorough inspection, experts found no evidence or traces in the vehicles. During the same period, the team of investigators decided on the appropriateness of conducting further interviews with Christopher and Nathan, considering their presence with David on the evening prior to the disappearance. The police invited Christopher to the station, where he once again confirmed his initial statements provided the day before. Moreover, Christopher agreed to voluntarily undergo a lie detector test, the results of which showed no signs of deception, after which he was released. Sometime after leaving the police station and returning to his workplace, Christopher saw Sheriff Clark's patrol car and signaled for him to stop. Sheriff Clark, who led the police department of the small town of Whiten, had known Christopher for over 17 years since his childhood. Clark maintained a warm relationship with his foster parents and was respected by Christopher, who turned to him for advice and support during tough times, such as the sudden death of his mother. Approaching Christopher, Clark listened to his account of the situation regarding Rowan's disappearance. Although the sheriff was aware of the missing girl, he had not been involved in the investigation, which was being conducted under the auspices of the Stella Department. During their conversation, Clark felt that Christopher's behavior seemed somewhat unnatural, leading him to suspect that Christopher might be withholding important information. Considering the critical importance of Rowan's life and safety, whose fate remained unclear, Clark decided to share his suspicions with the FBI agents. Speaking to the agents, the sheriff expressed his concerns about Christopher, suggesting that he might be hiding key information that could indicate Rowan's stepfather's involvement in her disappearance. Sheriff Clark speculated that David might have convinced Christopher to alter the details of his story about that night, and now Christopher feared that the truth might implicate him as an accomplice in the crime. Highlighting his deep, trust-based relationship with Christopher, Clark offered his help in persuading the man to share everything he knew. That evening, Christopher decided to visit Rowan's mother to inquire about the progress of the search in David's absence. By this time, FBI agents had arrived at the house wanting to speak again with the girl's mother. Noticing Christopher, they asked him additional questions. Christopher confirmed his previous version of events, but for the first time, expressed suspicion of David's potential guilt in Rowan's disappearance, expressing a desire to help uncover the truth in any way possible. He even offered to use a listening device in a conversation with David to elicit a possible confession, but the investigators decided to postpone the use of this method. Instead, the agents inquired with Christopher about places where, in his opinion, David might have hidden Rowan's body. Christopher suggested several potential locations that could serve as hiding spots for the body. At dawn the next day, the law enforcement team began a thorough inspection of the locations Christopher had indicated, while also continuing to patrol the area around Stella. Meanwhile, FBI agents called David in for another interrogation, where he consistently denied any accusations against him. During the search of his residence, investigators looked for any clues that could shed light on the situation, but found none. Meanwhile, Christopher visited Sheriff Clark to discuss his recent interaction with the FBI. During their conversation, the sheriff's impression that Christopher was still withholding certain details was reinforced. After this meeting, Clark again reached out to the investigators, suggesting that Christopher was hiding information critically important for proving David's guilt. FBI agents, taking into account Christopher's previous appeals to Sheriff Clark and his openness to discussing the case, suggested Clark continue attempts to have a full conversation with him, suspecting Christopher wanted to share significant information, but was hesitating for some reason. The next day, November 7th, the police invited Christopher to the station again to obtain his permission to inspect a safe located in David's house. Several months before, Christopher had temporarily lived with David and left some of his belongings there. Christopher not only consented to the safe's inspection, but also allowed his trailer and car to be checked. Moreover, he provided a DNA sample and agreed to be reinterrogated. During the interrogation, investigators revisited the events of that night, trying to clarify and confirm David's story. During this dialogue, investigators were faced with an unexpected turn of events. Christopher suddenly declared that his friend's story did not match reality, signaling the investigators to intensify the interrogation to uncover the truth. However, the increased pressure frightened Christopher. He became visibly nervous and warned that if the accusatory tone and assumptions about his involvement in the child's disappearance continued, he would refuse further communication. As a result, the interrogation was halted, and Christopher left the police building. That same evening, he visited Sheriff Clark to share his concerns about the interrogation, expressing his outrage at the investigators' suspicious behavior and contemplating the need for a lawyer. Sheriff Clark affirmed his right to legal defense, but recommended trying to understand the investigators' actions and continuing cooperation in the search for Rowan. In response, Christopher stated he no longer wished to communicate directly with the police, preferring to share information only through the sheriff. Clark insisted on the importance of disclosing all information Christopher knew. During this conversation, Christopher could not hold back tears, expressing his fondness for Rowan and assuring that he could never harm her. Living in David's house had fostered his emotional bond with Rowan and the other children, who over time came to regard him as Uncle Christopher. Sheriff Clark felt Christopher was on the verge of disclosing important information. However, their conversation was unexpectedly interrupted by visitors, which distracted Clark. At that moment, Christopher, without waiting for their conversation to resume, quietly left the sheriff's office and disappeared, not divulging the secret he was prepared to share. Sheriff Clark initiated another dialogue with FBI agents, sharing details of his last conversation with Christopher. He expressed the belief that Christopher was on the brink of revealing everything, but warned that any pressure might provoke him to completely refuse cooperation and seek legal aid. Clark suggested giving Christopher some time to reflect, to which the detectives agreed. The next day, the search for Rowan continued unsuccessfully, but the situation dramatically changed on November 9th, a week after the girl's disappearance. Search teams reached a remote area near Powell, located 16 kilometers from Stella. There, among fields and trees, they found a large natural depression. Inspecting it, the team discovered the girl's body hidden under a layer of leaves and debris at the bottom of the pit. Rowan's body was unclothed below the waist, except for one sock, and strangulation marks were observed on her neck. Medical experts confirmed the victim had been subjected to violence. Following this tragic discovery, FBI agents approached Sheriff Clark with a request to meet again with Christopher, hoping that in light of new circumstances, he would be ready to share all his knowledge about the case. On the morning of that day, Sheriff Clark received information that Christopher had visited the police station in his absence, leaving a message for him through colleagues about the need for an urgent conversation. Reacting to this message, the sheriff set out to look for Christopher, checking all possible places the man might be, but without success. The situation changed when Christopher himself contacted Clark, expressing clear concern and questioning if he was under surveillance. He explained that, shaken by the news of Rowan's body being found, he tried to calm himself by driving around town and noticed an unknown gray car following him. Sheriff Clark assured Christopher that he was unaware of any surveillance and offered to meet for a discussion. When they met, Christopher appeared extremely nervous and expressed fears for his safety, worried that he could be implicated in the crime following the discovery of Rowan's body and fearing retribution. Clark transported him back to the station, emphasizing that with the case being reclassified as a murder, it was time for Christopher to reveal everything he knew. Again, under the influence of emotions, Christopher broke down in tears. The sheriff tried to persuade him to share information about David's actions towards Rowan. However, Christopher expressed a reluctance to discuss this matter at the police station due to the presence of many people, suggesting a more secluded place for the conversation. He pointed to a small bridge located near their town. Sheriff Clark agreed to the suggestion, and they headed to the specified location to continue their conversation. After carefully parking his car, Christopher unexpectedly got out and extended his hand to the sheriff. With a mysterious voice, he said that he needed to be handcuffed. The sheriff was taken aback by such a request and responded negatively, convincing Christopher of the senselessness of such an action. But Christopher insisted, "After what I tell you, you won't be able to refuse." With these words, he began his story. First, Christopher repeated the initial part of the story he had once told the police. Together with Nate and David, they went to his trailer, where they continued to drink for some time. Later, the friends decided to go their separate ways. In turn, David asked Nate to drive him. They decided to take the back roads to avoid encountering the police and left. Then Christopher began to tell what would shock the sheriff. He claimed that that evening there was a desire to assault Rowan, and he quickly devised a plan. Knowing his friends would take a long time since the road through the fields took much more time, Christopher headed to David's house, choosing the direct route via the main highway. He entered Rowan's room, picked her up, and silently carried her out of the house so as not to wake the girl. After that, he took her to his trailer, where he committed violence against her. According to the man, she only woke up at that moment and tried to resist, but she couldn't escape. Christopher didn't turn on the light and didn't speak to her, as he didn't want her to recognize him after the incident. He planned to take her back home and leave, but things didn't go as he wanted. When he carried Rowan out of the trailer, the moon was bright enough for her to see his face. At that moment, Christopher panicked, grabbed a rope, and strangled the victim. After she died, he loaded her body into his car and started to think about what to do next. Initially, he wanted to drop her off the bridge, the very one he stood on with Sheriff Clark. But Christopher realized her body would be found too quickly. So he drove around the county, pondering other options. Soon he remembered a large pit near the neighboring town and headed there. He dropped the girl's body into the pit and tried to cover it with branches. However, the pit's diameter was too large, and everything fell to the bottom. Returning to the trailer, Christopher found Rowan's bloodstains on his clothes and mattress. Moreover, he needed to dispose of her pants and underwear, as well as the rope he used to kill her. He collected all these items and put them in a large barrel, intending to burn them. However, Christopher quickly realized that such a fire would definitely attract attention. So he dragged the barrel into a shed, closed the door, and started the fire there. Sheriff Clark was entirely unprepared for such a turn of events. Throughout the time, he believed that David committed the crime, and Christopher was only hiding some information. It was hard for the sheriff to believe that someone he had known for almost 20 years could be capable of such brutality. Christopher himself had raised 3 small children, although they did not live together after he divorced his wife. He always seemed like a reliable and decent person. However, the reality was much more tragic. After Christopher finished in the fall of 2023, A girl arrived at a park with her parents and decided to go for a bike ride. However, she did not return, which caused her parents to worry. They contacted the police, who began extensive search operations. Soon, they came across alarming evidence that dramatically changed the direction of the investigation. Ultimately, detectives were able to uncover the truth, and the ending of this story turned out to be quite unexpected. Charlotte Sin was born on September 4, 2014, in the small American town of Greenfields, New York. She grew up in a large and close-knit family with loving parents and two sisters, one older and one younger. Charlotte was an active and cheerful child who loved hanging out with friends, spending time with her sisters, and going on nature trips with her parents. Greenfields, with its population of just over 5,000 people, was surrounded by forests, lakes, and scenic parks, allowing the girl's family to frequently enjoy outdoor activities. On September 30th, 2023, when Charlotte was 9 years old, her parents, along with some acquaintances, decided to visit a national park located about 18 kilometers from their home. The girl eagerly awaited this trip since her friends were also joining, and they all planned to ride bikes around the park. Upon arrival, the girl's parents set up camp, and soon the children went off to ride their bikes. The park had designated circular tracks, one of which was near their campsite. Therefore, Charlotte and her friends chose this track and set out around 6:15 p.m. The plan was to return to the adults before it got dark. After a few rounds, when Charlotte's friends wanted to return, she said she hadn't had enough and wanted to go for another round. Her friends headed back to the camp, while Charlotte went in the opposite direction on her bike. Sometime later, her parents began to worry as Charlotte should have returned after one round, which took no more than 10 minutes, even at a slow pace. However, the girl did not return, and the adults decided to search for her. They walked along the circular track, and around 6:45, they were met with a very troubling discovery. Charlotte's bike was abandoned next to the path, but the girl was nowhere to be found. Her parents immediately feared the worst scenario, that someone had kidnapped their daughter. There were no logical reasons for the girl to abandon her bike halfway and walk somewhere on foot. They considered possible problems with the bike, but it soon became clear that the wheels were intact and the chain was in place. The parents decided not to waste any time and immediately called the police. Officers arrived at the scene about 15 minutes later and began immediate searches. The found abandoned bike led them to a dismal conclusion. Charlotte had likely been kidnapped. However, they did not rule out the possibility that the girl might have simply gotten lost in the forest. So they set out to search. The police cordoned off the entire park and closed it to visitors, also asking everyone to leave the premises after checking and recording their personal information. Some people wanted to stay and help with the search, but without proper organization, this only complicated the police's efforts. They began a thorough examination of every part of the forest. Initially, officers inspected the area along the circular path the girl had ridden on, but they couldn't find any traces. Then they expanded the search area to encompass the entire park. However, covering its entire territory, which spanned about 25 square kilometers, was extremely difficult, taking into account its size. Therefore, the police sought assistance from park rangers, the fire department, and the state police. Later, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, joined the investigation, focusing on attempts to identify a possible kidnapper. They tried to find surveillance cameras near the park and along the adjacent roads. It was clear that if the girl had indeed been kidnapped, the criminal must have taken her away by car. The FBI agents also requested information about all visitors from the Park Service. Each person had to register and pay for the park visit, so their information was stored in a database. However, analyzing this information took a lot of time since the park had a significant number of visitors that day. Additionally, they requested cell phone operators for the location data of all phones present in the park at the time of Charlotte's disappearance. They did not exclude the possibility that the kidnapper might have entered the park by circumventing the rules and not registering at the entrance. In such a case, FBI agents could match visitor data from the Park Service with the location of mobile phones to identify a suspect. However, collecting all these data also took a considerable amount of time. Moreover, this was not about precise tracking using GPS, but rather about estimating the phone's locations via cell towers. The search continued into the late night, but it yielded no results. Early the next morning, officers returned to the park, and even more people joined the search team. In total, more than 400 people were looking for the girl. The police also turned to the public through the media, asking them to share any information that could be related to Charlotte's disappearance. This case quickly garnered widespread attention, and a press conference dedicated to it was attended by the state governor, who came to the park to support the family. That same morning, the police activated the Amber Alert system, which allows for the rapid dissemination of information about a child's disappearance. They didn't use it on the first day due to the need to ensure that the girl wasn't simply lost somewhere in the park. Now it was almost unequivocally clear that Charlotte had become a kidnapping victim, as she would have been found otherwise. Unfortunately, the searches again yielded no results, just as the FBI's attempts to identify the kidnapper. By the evening, the police began to realize that they were unlikely to find the girl alive. In cases of child abduction, the first few hours are critical, and during this time there are high chances of finding the child alive. However, after 24 hours have passed, the statistical probability of a positive outcome drastically decreases, and the search for Charlotte had just crossed this threshold. Yet the police and the girl's parents were not ready to give up. Early in the morning of the third day, they returned to the park to continue combing through it. Meanwhile, around 4:20 a.m., a car approached the Charlotte family's home, from which an unknown man emerged. He walked up to the mailbox, dropped a letter inside, and immediately drove away. A police officer observed this but did not approach the stranger, assuming he was a family acquaintance writing words of support for Charlotte's parents. Over these days, similar individuals had come to the house repeatedly, leaving letters and food. Nonetheless, the officer found the man suspicious. He went to check the mailbox, where he found a note. The contents of the note instantly changed the course of the investigation. It claimed to be from the unknown abductor, stating that he was holding the girl and was ready to release her in exchange for $50,000. The note was immediately sent to a laboratory, where experts urgently began its examination. Soon they discovered several fingerprints and checked them against databases, but one was smudged and no matches were found. Around 2:30, it was time for a second attempt, and the investigators were hoping for a breakthrough. A fingerprint led them to a 47-year-old man named Craig Nelson Ross Jr. He had been in the New York State database since 1999, when he was arrested for drunk driving. Ross lived just a few kilometers from Charlotte's family home, and the police immediately headed there. However, they encountered a problem. The house at this address had recently been confiscated because the man had not paid taxes on it for several years. The police started gathering information on this individual and soon established that he had lately been living in a trailer on the back lot of his mother's property. The woman's home was located 22 kilometers from Greenfields. The police immediately obtained a warrant and went to the location. They deployed helicopters and more than 30 Special Forces officers who surrounded the trailer and burst in using flashbang grenades. Ross, who was inside, attempted to resist but was quickly arrested by the officers. However, there was no sign of the girl, and the officers thought she might not be there. They began to search the entire trailer and looked into a closed cupboard filled with a pile of rags. As the officers moved them aside, they found Charlotte underneath. The girl was alive and immediately ran to her rescuers. She was promptly taken to the hospital for a checkup, and it was determined that she was not harmed. Charlotte received no injuries, so she was quickly discharged and taken home. Her parents, like the hundreds of participants in the search operation, were overjoyed. The girl's relatives were immediately taken to the hospital, where they were reunited with Charlotte. Notably, just 10 minutes before her release, the girl's mother shared with acquaintances a strange premonition. She was in the park where the active search was ongoing. At one moment, the woman said she had a strong feeling predicting that her daughter would return home, and 10 minutes later, the police informed them of Charlotte's release. Meanwhile, detectives arrested Ross without bail and took him in for questioning. Given that this case occurred very recently, the police are still revealing details of their conversation with the kidnapper. However, he did not admit his guilt, so the case will be taken to court. There is information about the suspect and his motives. Ross's former girlfriend told journalists that she had obtained a restraining order against him in 2017. At that time, she lived with him, his 12-year-old son, and his 14-year-old daughter at his mother's house. During an argument, the man attacked her and attempted to strangle her. After that, she contacted the police. According to her, Ross might have been planning the kidnapping for many months. She explained that the man always looked for ways to live off others, trying to rely on his mother, while also playing on people's sympathy by claiming he had a severe illness. Regarding Charlotte's abduction, Ross's former girlfriend suggests that he initially targeted her family for a ransom. Even though the girl's parents were average middle-class people, her late grandfather owned a significant estate. In 1998, he sustained a serious injury and won over $2 million in compensation in a lawsuit against the city authorities. This story is still alive in the memory of Greenfields' residents, although more than 20 years have passed. It is known that Ross's former girlfriend claims he was aware of the compensation payment and likely decided to profit from the kidnapping. Considering that Charlotte was abducted from the park at a moment when she was unattended for just a few minutes, Ross, in his former girlfriend's opinion, might have been observing the family for a long time, studying their schedule, and waiting for the right moment to commit the crime. Another fact voiced by the former girlfriend is that several months before the abduction, the man covered all the windows of his trailer with tarps, which he had never done before. Given that Charlotte was found there, this may indicate meticulous preparation. Ross's neighbors also shared alarming observations. One woman claims that the man tried to take her 10-year-old son, forcing her to intervene. Another neighbor reported that the Ross family had always been problematic, and Ross himself often turned to neighbors for food since childhood. The police also discovered additional information about Ross's criminal past. A year before the attack on his girlfriend, he was arrested for stalking but did not receive severe punishment. Just a month before the kidnapping, Charlotte Ross was a suspect in the abuse of his underage female relative. However, that case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. Reporters also interviewed his son, who was an adult at the time. He stated that he hated his father and wished him a prison death, but did not reveal any details. About a month after Ross's arrest, police made some disappointing statements. In addition to the kidnapping charge, he was charged with sexually assaulting Charlotte. Apparently, while Ross was holding the girl in his trailer, he had time to commit a crime against her, but police have yet to release details. Ross denies guilt on the abuse charges and plans to defend himself in court, despite the fact that the abducted girl was found in his trailer. He has little chance of getting away with it, however, as in addition to the fingerprints on the ransom letter, investigators have found other circumstantial evidence implicating him. By examining the location data of all the phones in the park at the time of the kidnapping, they found that Ross's smartphone was one of them. Thus, there is little doubt that the man is going to jail. However, detectives are now also investigating Ross's possible involvement in two other unsolved cases. In August 2003, an 18-year-old girl named Jennifer Uman disappeared in a town called Milton, where she was selling magazines. Her remains were found near a lake 18 kilometers from the town 6 years later. Interestingly, she disappeared just a few hundred meters from the house where Ross was living at the time. 2 years after this incident, 19-year-old Christina White left a trailer park a kilometer from Milton and disappeared. A year later, police found her remains, but the case was never solved. As for Ross, he was living in the same trailer park at the time. Police are now looking into his possible involvement in the murders. However, so far they do not have any evidence or are keeping it under wraps for the sake of the investigation. As for Charlotte's trial, it is set to begin in April 2024. Despite the presence of irrefutable evidence of his guilt, it cannot be ruled out that Ross may be offered a deal with the investigation. In case he continues to deny his guilt, he will most likely have to appear in court and give all the details of what he did to the girl. To avoid such a traumatic experience for Charlotte, the perpetrator may well be offered a deal. We'll be following the progress of this case. The mother allowed her daughter to ride her bike around the courtyard, but when she checked on her a few minutes later, she discovered that the girl had vanished without a trace. Police were immediately called, but they were unable to find either the child or her bicycle. The mystery continued for 2 years until an unexpected breakthrough in the investigation revealed the shocking truth about the disappearance. Kelly Ann Polton was born on September 20th, 1989, in Rochester, New York, and was the only child in her family. Her parents surrounded her with limitless love and care. However, when she was 3 years old, her parents decided to divorce. Kelly stayed with her mother, while her father maintained a warm relationship with his ex-wife and continued to see his daughter. Kelly's mother, Judy, moved to a quiet residential complex in the suburbs of Rochester. Despite financial support from her ex-husband, they lived modestly. When the girl turned 4, her mother started working part-time, dreaming of saving enough money for a trip to Disneyland together. Judy's job involved delivering magazines to subscribers in her area. On the evening of May 23, 1994, she was preparing for another delivery, sitting at home and inserting advertising brochures into magazines before their distribution. Around 6:45 p.m., Kelly expressed a desire to go outside, taking advantage of the beautiful weather to ride her bright tricycle. Peering outside and seeing that the playground was filled with children, Judy decided to let her daughter play outside for a while, warning her to stay within sight and not to leave the area near their home. Kelly happily went outside on her tricycle, while her mother finished preparing the magazines and planned to head to McDonald's. After finishing the magazine preparation, Judy went to her car to load the magazines, deciding to call Kelly home in the process. However, upon stepping outside, she found no trace of her daughter. Judy searched the surroundings and started calling Kelly by name, but received no answer. Walking around the house and not finding her daughter, she expanded her search to the entire residential complex, but Kelly was nowhere to be found. The absence of the characteristic sound of the tricycle's wheels on the asphalt, which always accompanied the girl's riding, was particularly alarming. Everything around was unusually quiet, emphasizing the absence of any signs of her daughter. With growing despair, Judy became increasingly panicked. Her loud cries for help immediately attracted the attention of neighbors, who rushed to find out what had happened. The woman asked if anyone had seen her daughter, but only a few noted that they had seen Kelly playing in the yard with other children, unaware of her subsequent whereabouts. Hearing about the disappearance, neighbors did not hesitate to join the search, but neither Kelly nor her bicycle was found. The residential complex's territory was mostly covered with vegetation, and it was surrounded by a fence protecting it from the neighboring road. Convinced that her daughter couldn't have left on her own, Judy knew two things. First, Kelly was aware of the boundaries within which she was allowed to ride and always followed this rule. Second, given the small size of her bike, the girl couldn't have gone far and remained unnoticed. Fearing the worst, Judy immediately contacted the police. Arriving on the scene in no time, the officers began their actions, joined by fire crews and canine units with dogs, who started a thorough inspection of the area and adjacent lots. While law enforcement spread out to search the residential buildings for Kelly, the police theorized that the girl was unlikely to have left the residential complex on her own. Considering a possible abduction, the main suspicions would likely fall on local residents, as it would be difficult for an outsider to enter the complex unnoticed, approach the house, snatch the girl, take her to a car, and carry out all these actions without being detected. In the residential complex, which includes 300 apartments, residents readily allowed the police to enter, genuinely eager to aid in the search for the missing girl. In instances where no one was present in the apartments, the complex manager provided the police with spare keys for access. Despite these efforts, no results were forthcoming. Neither the girl nor her bike were found. The search continued all night, and around 4 in the morning, the case was reclassified as an abduction, and a specialized unit, along with detectives, took over the investigation. They asked Judy about possible enemies in their lives, mentioned Kelly's father, but the woman excluded his involvement, pointing to the father's regular communication with his daughter and lack of motive. Then the detectives inquired about people in the complex whose behavior might have seemed unusual or suspicious to her. In response, Judy mentioned a new resident, a 22-year-old man named Mark, who had recently moved in with his wife and 18-month-old son. According to Judy, Mark's behavior always seemed unconventional and troubling to her. During several random encounters in the yard, they conversed, and in one of these conversations, Mark commented on the beauty of her daughter. While Judy often heard similar compliments from others, the way Mark expressed himself seemed unusual to her. He then said something even more peculiar, claiming that he watched all the girls in the complex, and Kelly stood out as the most beautiful. Judy found such remarks to be very alarming, and she tried to limit any further interaction with him. Despite this, their paths sometimes crossed, And at one of these meetings, Mark asked Judy a question she found highly inappropriate. He inquired whether Kelly would tell her if someone tried to touch her. Judy affirmed and immediately walked away from Mark, considering such a question to be very suspicious. Before these events, Kelly often played with Mark's son on the playground, but afterwards Judy did not allow her daughter to approach him, even when she was nearby. During the conversation with the detectives, Judy recalled another moment. Shortly after she began searching for her daughter outside, she noticed Mark, who had come to the playground with his son. When she asked him about Kelly, he denied seeing her. She also found it odd that his shoes were without laces, but at that moment, she didn't give it much thought, as she was focused on her concern for her daughter. Deciding to question Mark, detectives brought him to the police station. The man denied any involvement in Kelly's disappearance and even agreed to a polygraph test. The polygraph operator found no signs of deception in his answers, which led to the necessity of releasing Mark. Furthermore, Judy unwittingly confirmed his alibi, remembering seeing him with his son at the playground during the period she was searching for her daughter. At the initial stage of the search, Mark's apartment was inspected by the police, where neither Kelly's bike nor the girl herself was found. Consequently, Mark was ruled out as a suspect, and detectives continued their investigation without any significant leads. Their actions included scrutinizing Judy for involvement in her daughter's disappearance. The woman understood this was part of the standard procedure and cooperated with the police, answering questions. However, the lack of other suspects and the prolonged attention to her from law enforcement only intensified her grief. Information about Kelly's disappearance was widely disseminated in the local media, as well as through billboards and flyers throughout the city. This led to an overwhelming number of calls to the police with potential information, exceeding 1,000. Each tip was meticulously checked by investigators, but none led to solving the mystery of the girl's disappearance, and the case reached a deadlock for an extended period. Despite the lack of noticeable progress in the search, Judy did not lose hope of finding her daughter alive. She took leave from work and dedicated herself to the search, actively engaging in printing and distributing flyers and seeking support from various media outlets. Her efforts resonated with the public. Volunteers actively helped her, and a sum of $100,000 was collected, offered as a reward for any information that could help find Kelly. Moreover, her daughter's story was featured at the national level, including participation in the famous Oprah Winfrey Show and mention in a program investigating unsolved crimes. Judy did not stop there. She arranged with local businesses to distribute flyers in their offices, factories, and even on company transport. She also managed to convince 2 airlines to include these flyers in their ticket packets, attracting additional attention and new tips, each of which was carefully checked by the police. However, all these efforts did not lead to a significant breakthrough in the investigation, and it continued for 2 years until an unexpected event occurred in 1996. On August 9th, a call came into the police from a woman reporting a serious argument with her husband. According to the woman, she had reached her limit due to her husband's ambiguous behavior and declared her desire to divorce. In an attempt to keep her, the husband tried to appeal to her feelings, playing the victim of circumstances and complaining about personal hardships. Suddenly, he confessed to the murder of Kelly Polton, shocking his wife deeply. She immediately took her child and went to her father's house, from where she called 911. During the call, she revealed her husband's name, Mark Christie, the very man who was Judy's neighbor. This story was a surprise for the detectives, yet they immediately faced a legal obstacle. According to state law, any information shared between spouses was protected by confidentiality and could not be used as evidence in court. This meant that even Mark's confession did not provide grounds for his arrest and interrogation. Furthermore, as previously mentioned, the man's residence had been searched at the beginning of the investigation, and he had been seen walking with a child soon after Kelly's disappearance, casting doubt on his ability to commit the crime. Despite the challenges that arose, Detective Crow, upon hearing the revelations from Mark's wife, immediately wanted to have a conversation with Mark himself. It turned out that Mark and his family had left the residential complex where Kelly lived shortly after her disappearance, with serious allegations being the reason for their departure. Parents of 2 girls complained about Mark, pointing out that he stood naked in his doorway in their presence. Despite the lack of an official investigation into these complaints, since Mark was within his own home, this fact seemed very suspicious to Crow. Mark had moved to a town 50 miles away from Rochester, and Crow set out to find him. However, his visit was not successful. Mark's mother met him at the door, informing him that her son would not speak to the police without a lawyer. They had already contacted a lawyer in anticipation of this meeting. It appeared Mark was aware of his wife's conversation with the police regarding their argument, and Crow realized he was at a dead end. Given the impossibility of using Mark's confession to his wife in court, a lawyer could easily forbid any attempts by the police to contact his client. Thus, Mark could continue living freely without fear of further pursuit. Nonetheless, Crow was not quick to admit defeat. While he was talking to Mark's mother, Mark himself appeared at the doorway. The detective managed to convince him that his intentions were merely to ask a few questions about Kelly's case. Crow suggested going to a nearby cafe for a chat over a cup of coffee. To Crow's surprise, Mark agreed, on the condition that he would be taken to his lawyer after the conversation. They stopped at a cozy Italian cafe nearby. Throughout the meeting, the detective maintained a calm and friendly conversation, trying not to pressure Mark. And this strategy bore fruit. Before their order even arrived, Mark suddenly began to pour out his soul. He confessed that the act he had committed against Kelly had tormented him for the past 2 years. The image of the girl, which flashed in the news and on flyers, haunted him everywhere. Crow remained extremely cautious, fearing to scare Mark off with too much pressure. He was one of the first detectives on Kelly's disappearance case, so their dialogue was not their first. Crow hoped that Mark might feel a sense of satisfaction from having deceived the police and decided to use this, playing on his ego. He told Mark that he had indeed managed to fool the entire investigative team, and this tactic truly worked. Mark stated that he didn't want to appear self-satisfied, emphasizing that the method he used to dispose of the bicycle was indeed ingenious. He wondered if the detective would like to know the details of this operation, but immediately cautioned that he was willing to share information only about the bicycle, not touching on other aspects of the case. Crow continued to interact with Mark in a light and friendly tone, trying to extract as much information as possible while making it clear that Mark was not obliged to share anything he didn't want to discuss. Then Mark revealed that Kelly's bicycle was in his living space for 3 whole days after her disappearance. He realized that if a child's life was threatened, the police could conduct a search without a warrant, checking every apartment in the complex. But there was a specific limitation in the law. It allowed searching for a missing child, but not for evidence related to their disappearance. This meant the police had the right to inspect only those places where a child theoretically could be. Taking advantage of this loophole in the law, Mark decided to cut the bicycle into pieces and hide them in various hidden corners of his apartment, which were clearly not intended for hiding a child. For example, Mark wrapped some parts of the bike in clothes and stacked them neatly in closets, while other parts were packed in compact bags, which he then carried to his car. He then began disposing of the parts in stages, discarding them away from his residence. Police officers were on duty at the exit of the compound, searching every vehicle, including Mark's vehicle, which was checked repeatedly. However, since the officers' attention was focused on finding the missing girl, the small bags went unnoticed. As he listened to Mark's story, Crow realized that he had a chance to elicit a full confession from him. He began to convince Mark that the girl's death might not have been his fault, but only a tragic accident. When asked about possible punishment, Mark heard Crow say that he could face up to 25 years in prison. Mark countered that he thought such a punishment was unfair, as he would have to spend half of his life in prison, missing the opportunity to be near his wife and son. He also mentioned that the last 2 years of his life had been a personal hell, which he felt should be taken into account when sentencing him. Despite the strangeness of such statements, Crow continued to follow his strategy of suggesting that Mark ease his soul by telling what really happened. The man replied that he was ready to confess everything, but only after talking to a lawyer. Of course, the detective realized that no lawyer would allow his client to confess to a crime, even if he really committed it and if there was no evidence against him. So he decided to be honest with Mark about it and added that in that case the girl's parents would never know what had happened to their daughter or whether she had suffered before she died. And then Mark replied, "She didn't suffer." The detective sensed that the man was ready to admit everything. So he said it was time to do the right thing for his own sake, his family's sake, and God's sake. Upon hearing this, Mark looked at the detective and finally confessed what he had done. He repeated that the girl had not suffered and said he had strangled her. He then added that he did not do anything to her, meaning abuse. According to Mark, that night, Callie drove up to his apartment and asked to play with his 1.5-year-old son. The man let her in and took the girl's bike into the kitchen. He realized that Kaylee's mother would not allow the girl into his home, so he decided not to attract attention. Callie went up to the second floor of the apartment to the children's room and began playing with the child. About 10 minutes later, Mark heard Judy go out into the yard and start calling his daughter's name. The man panicked, realizing that his mother would be furious that he had let the girl into his home without her permission. So Mark went up to his child's room and strangled Callie with his bare hands. Of course, Detective Crow immediately had doubts about the plausibility of some aspects of the story. Much more likely would be the version that Mark himself lured the girl to his apartment under the pretext of playing with his son, taking advantage of the fact that his wife was at work. There, he could have committed any lewd acts against her, and when he heard Judy calling for her, he was afraid that Callie would tell her. The detective also remembered that Judy had seen him on the street wearing sneakers without laces and allowed that the man had actually used them when he choked the girl, and that would mean that the crime was not so spontaneous, since he would have had time to think things over while he took the laces out of the sneakers. Apparently, Mark tried to minimize the gravity of his crime by omitting some details. Crow understood that if he expressed his doubts, Mark might change his mind and refuse to talk about what he did with the body. However, the detective needed this information, so he continued to nod and listen to Mark's story. Mark stated that after committing the murder, he carried Kelly's body to the kitchen and left it on the floor. Then he took his son and went outside to create an alibi for himself. The man continued to hear Judy calling her daughter in the yard, so he specifically wanted to be seen by her to remove any suspicion from himself. After the woman saw him at the playground and left to search for her daughter around the complex, Mark returned home and placed Kelly's body in a laundry basket, covering it with clothes. A few minutes later, he took the basket outside and placed it in the trunk of his car. At that time, there were many people in the yard helping Judy look for her daughter, and such chaos reigned that no one even paid attention to Mark. He freely got into his car, took his son, and drove to the facility where he worked as a security guard. Arriving at the back of the large building, Mark left the basket with Kelly's body next to the door, and after driving around the building, entered through the main entrance. On his day off, Mark fabricated an excuse for his colleagues, claiming he needed to return to work for items he had forgotten there, which raised no suspicion. Because of this, he effortlessly passed through the workspace and unlocked the back door from the inside. Then the man took the basket containing the victim and approached a huge refrigerant tank with a capacity of over 100,000 liters. Opening the top lid, he threw Kelly inside after tying a heavy metal object he found nearby to her. Following this, Mark disposed of the victim's clothes, specifying that he did not remove her earrings. After eliminating the body, he returned home and joined the search for Kelly with other residents of the complex, managing to remove the body from the premises before the police arrived, remaining unnoticed. At the end of his confession, he said that killing Kelly was a big mistake and he should not have done it. Having obtained all the necessary information, Detective Crow paid the bill for their meal and Mark left a $2 tip. Then Mark went to the police station with the detective without objection, where he was arrested on a murder charge. As soon as Mark's lawyer learned about his confessional statements, he tried to have them annulled and retracted, but to no avail. Mark had provided all the information voluntarily, and Detective Crow's actions were entirely within the law. Without delay, the police went to Mark's workplace, where the specified tank was opened. 2 years later, the girl's remains were still inside, and although the degree of decomposition of the remains did not allow for an exact determination of the cause of death or other circumstances, experts confirmed her identity. Judy was finally able to hold a funeral for her daughter. Mark pleaded guilty in court and was sentenced to a minimum of 25 years in prison, as Crow had anticipated. The lawyer managed to negotiate a deal in which the kidnapping charge was dropped, leaving only the murder sentence in effect. However, Mark's story did not end there. In 2010, the police decided to revisit a 1988 case when 74-year-old Viola Menville was brutally murdered in a Rochester suburb after going out for a walk. Among several suspects was Mark, who at that time was only 16 years old. After an interrogation with a polygraph, the operator detected no signs of deception. Frank Sterling was eventually arrested for the murder of Viola Menville. Initially, he denied any involvement, but under the pressure of continuous interrogation throughout the night, he eventually confessed. After Frank was imprisoned, he attempted to contest his conviction, arguing that his confession was coerced under police pressure. And by the end of the interrogation, he barely understood the situation. However, all of Frank's attempts to prove his innocence failed until 2010, when the case was reopened and DNA found at the crime scene was sent for analysis. The results showed that the sample did not belong to Frank, but a match was found in the FBI database with Mark Christie. In 2011, Mark, then 39 years old, was charged with the murder of Viola and received an additional 28 years in prison. Mark never explained his motives, nor expressed any remorse. Frank was released after 19 years of wrongful imprisonment, sued the state, and in 2014 was awarded nearly $10 million. However, 3 years later, Frank died of a heart attack at the age of 54. Mark continues to serve his sentence, and with changes in New York state law, he may be eligible for early release in the coming years, though there are no guarantees of his release. It's important to note that if the investigation into Viola Menville's case had not focused solely on Frank as the suspect, and had not coerced him into confessing to a crime he did not commit, Mark might have been arrested earlier, and Kelly might not have become his victim. But events unfolded differently.
In a picturesque town, a woman named Amanda Everwood stood out with her striking chestnut hair and captivating blue eyes. She embodied grace and creativity, a trait inherited from her family of artists. The aroma of oil paints and the sight of canvases in progress filled her childhood home. Amanda's mother bestowed her with artistic talent, while her father instilled in her an unyielding determination. As a result, she quickly garnered recognition as an extraordinary landscape artist, captivating audiences with her vibrant color palette and her ability to capture nature's essence. Conversely, Richard Everwood hailed from a distinguished lineage of legal professionals. The Everwood family boasted generations of judges, attorneys, and legal scholars, and Richard was no exception. He thrived in law school, graduating at the top of his class, and swiftly ascended the ranks at a prestigious Belleville law firm. Richard's charm, handsome appearance, and keen intellect made him a formidable lawyer and an attractive husband. Their worlds collided during their sophomore year of college, a quintessential example of opposites attracting. Amanda's free-spirited nature harmonized with Richard's structured and disciplined lifestyle. Love blossomed between them amidst late-night study sessions, gallery openings, and summer road trips. Upon graduation, they exchanged vows in a lavish ceremony that became the talk of Belleville. They established their home in a beautiful Victorian house that Amanda adored, transforming it into a sanctuary filled with art, music, and love. The house boasted a spacious garden where Amanda frequently painted, drawing inspiration from the colorful flowers and the shifting seasons. Richard, however, was deeply committed to his work, often spending long hours at the office. Together, they welcomed a son named Ethan, who became the apple of Amanda's eye. On the surface, their life appeared idyllic. Amanda's days were filled with painting, volunteering at the local art center, and caring for Ethan. Richard's career continued to prosper, eventually earning him a partnership at his firm. They graced glamorous parties and charity events, often becoming the center of attention. However, as time passed, Amanda detected subtle changes in Richard. He grew increasingly distant, frequently arriving home late and departing early in the morning. The once affectionate and warm man she married had become cold and preoccupied. Amanda endeavored to disregard the shifts in their relationship, attributing them to the pressures of Richard's high-powered career. However, the nagging suspicion that lingered in her mind intensified with each passing day. Carla Rowe entered their lives when Richard employed her as his personal assistant. Carla was a vision of beauty, with her dark, flowing hair, striking features, and an air of self-assurance that captivated everyone she encountered. She was competent, intelligent, and seemed to comprehend Richard in a manner that Amanda found elusive. It wasn't long before Amanda's doubts centered around Carla. One fateful evening, Amanda resolved to confront Richard. She arranged a romantic, candle-lit dinner, hoping to rekindle their connection and encourage him to confide in her. As they sat facing each other at the dining table, Amanda revealed her apprehensions and fears. Richard listened attentively but brushed off her concerns, attributing his behavior to the demands of his job. He reassured her that there was no cause for alarm, yet Amanda remained unconvinced. Driven to unveil the truth, Amanda enlisted the services of a private investigator named Mark Collins. Mark was a seasoned expert with a reputation for discretion and meticulousness. Over the course of several weeks, he shadowed Richard and Carla, recording their exchanges. The evidence he amassed was incriminating: late-night meals, weekend getaways, and intimate moments that left no room for uncertainty. Richard was engaged in an affair with Carla. Amanda grappled with a whirlwind of emotions: fury, deception, and profound sorrow. She couldn't fathom how Richard could jeopardize their family in such a manner. Yet amidst her turmoil, she also experienced an unexpected sense of relief. At last, she possessed the truth, and she could determine her next steps. Equipped with the evidence, Amanda's initial despair paved the way for unwavering determination. She chose to confront Carla first, seeking to obtain more information before addressing Richard. Amanda orchestrated a rendezvous under the guise of discussing a philanthropic event sponsored by Richard's firm. Carla, oblivious to Amanda's true motives, consented to meet at a fashionable cafe nestled in the heart of the city. The cafe exuded a warm, intimate ambiance, enhanced by its soft lighting and luxurious seating. Amanda arrived ahead of schedule, selecting a secluded corner table that offered privacy for their conversation. A few minutes later, Carla entered the establishment, radiating self-assurance and grace as she approached the table. Amanda found herself experiencing a blend of curiosity and resentment. Carla extended a cordial greeting to Amanda, commenting on the enchanting atmosphere of the cafe. Amanda, concealing her true emotions, responded courteously and directed the conversation towards Richard. She mentioned his increased time spent at the office and inquired about his ability to manage the workload. Carla replied that Richard's dedication was unparalleled, and the cases he handled demanded considerable time and focus. Amanda then leaned closer, lowering her voice to reveal her knowledge of the affair. Carla's complexion lost its color, and she attempted to respond, but Amanda interjected, clarifying that she was not there to cast blame or accusations. Amanda simply sought to comprehend the reasons behind the infidelity. Carla, with tears welling in her eyes, recounted the story that began a few years prior when Richard faced challenges at work. They started spending more time together, and one event led to another. As Carla divulged the details, Amanda felt an unexpected sense of empathy. She recognized the anguish in Carla's eyes, a mirror of her own inner turmoil. By the conclusion of their conversation, an unanticipated bond had formed between them. Amanda found herself drawn to Carla's intellect and charisma, while Carla discovered comfort in Amanda's empathy and understanding. In the ensuing weeks, Amanda and Carla clandestinely continued their meetings. What initially began as a confrontation evolved into a multifaceted relationship. Their encounters grew more frequent, and their connection deepened. One evening, Carla extended an invitation to Amanda to visit her apartment, ostensibly to examine documents pertaining to the charity event. The apartment boasted a chic, contemporary design with floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased a breathtaking view of the city. As they reclined on the sofa, sipping wine and engaging in conversation, the air between them thickened with tension. Carla placed her glass aside and gazed into Amanda's eyes, confessing her burgeoning feelings. Amanda's heart pounded, for she too harbored similar sentiments, but had been hesitant to acknowledge them. She admitted her reciprocal feelings, and their lips met in a fervent embrace, marking the transition from emotional connection to physical intimacy that night. Their clandestine affair unfolded with intensity, a tempest of furtive moments and concealed trysts. Amanda felt invigorated in a manner she hadn't experienced in years, yet guilt and fear persistently gnawed at her. They sought refuge in the city's secluded nooks, concealed corners of parks, obscure cafes, and Carla's apartment, where they believed they were shielded from the world's scrutiny. Their discussions spanned profound philosophical debates to playful exchanges, revealing their hopes, aspirations, and apprehensions, and forging a connection that transcended physical desire. However, Amanda remained acutely conscious of the fragility of their circumstances. She recognized the dire repercussions that would ensue if Richard discovered their secret. Despite this, she found herself incapable of terminating the affair. Carla had become an indispensable presence in her life, filling a void she had been previously unaware of. Richard's suspicions mounted as he detected changes in Amanda's behavior. She seemed more distant, frequently preoccupied, and radiated a newfound self-assurance. Richard's paranoia drove him to install a concealed camera in Carla's apartment, suspecting that Amanda might have uncovered his infidelity and was orchestrating a scheme against him. Upon reviewing the footage and witnessing his wife with Carla, Richard's fury and sense of betrayal erupted. He felt emasculated and humiliated, convinced that both women had collaborated to deceive him. Richard embarked on a methodical plan to exact revenge, determined to reclaim control over his life. On a tempestuous night, Richard summoned Amanda to his office under the guise of desiring to discuss their relationship and explore a path forward. Amanda, hopeful for reconciliation, consented. Upon entering Richard's dimly illuminated office, Amanda was taken aback by the icy audacity in his gaze. Richard instructed her to sit, his tone devoid of feeling. Amanda complied, her heart racing. As she attempted to speak, Richard interrupted her, forcefully throwing a folder of compromising photographs onto the desk. He declared that he was aware of everything, including her liaison with Carla. Amanda's eyes widened in horror as she gazed upon the incriminating images. She implored Richard to hear her explanation, but he was consumed by rage. He lunged towards Amanda, his hands grasping her throat. Amanda fought back, frantically scratching at his hands, but Richard's hold remained steadfast. Her vision began to fade, and within moments she succumbed. Richard stood over Amanda's lifeless form, his mind a tempest of fury and bewilderment. He recognized the urgency to conceal his actions. He orchestrated the scene to resemble a burglary gone awry, ransacking the office and scattering documents haphazardly. He then drove to Carla's residence, his anger reaching a boiling point. Carla was startled to find Richard at her door. She inquired about his unexpected arrival, her voice quivering. Richard forced his way inside, his eyes wild with wrath. He blamed her for ruining everything, accusing her of seducing his wife and shattering his family. Carla retreated, terror gripping her heart, and pleaded with Richard to hear her out and comprehend the situation. But Richard was deaf to her words. He lunged at Carla, who narrowly evaded him, seizing a heavy vase and striking it against his head. Richard stumbled, momentarily disoriented. Carla seized the chance to escape, fleeing into the stormy night with only the clothes she wore. She raced through the rain-drenched streets, her thoughts overwhelmed by fear and confusion. She needed to put as much distance between herself and Richard as possible. She knew that if he found her, he would end her life. Carla reached the edge of town and discovered an old, deserted cabin. She slipped inside, her body shaking with adrenaline and dread. The following morning, Ethan Everwood discovered himself bereft of both a mother and, soon after, a father. Richard, in an attempt to conceal his wrongdoings, reported Amanda as missing and concocted an alibi. However, the police swiftly identified discrepancies in his account. Amanda's remains were found in Richard's office, and forensic evidence, coupled with his unstable behavior, implicated him in the crime. He was apprehended and subsequently found guilty of Amanda's murder, receiving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. Carla, on the other hand, had disappeared without a trace. Her vehicle was discovered abandoned at a rest area miles away from Belleville. Rumors circulated that she had left the country, but no concrete evidence ever surfaced. Some theorized that she had assumed a new identity and started anew. Carla's vanishing act perplexed many. Having grown up in a household characterized by religious zealotry and aggression, Carla had endured years of repression and fear. Escaping wasn't merely a means to flee, it was a lifeline to emancipation. She dreaded the consequences of being found by her family, all too familiar with the atrocities they could inflict upon her, compelling her to disappear without a trace, leaving behind a life of subjugation for one of uncertain freedom. Ethan, now an orphan, was welcomed into the home of Amanda's sister, Lydia, who nurtured him with love and devotion. The Everwood residence, once resounding with laughter and affection, now stood silent, a grim reminder of the tragic events that had transpired. Lydia endeavored to establish a stable environment for Ethan, but the shadow of his parents' calamity cast a long shadow over his childhood. She often pondered the kind of man Ethan would become, shouldering the burden of such a sinister legacy. Carla's flight was far from effortless. She recognized the necessity of departing from Belleville and vanishing entirely. She had saved some money and utilized it to purchase a bus ticket to the nearest metropolis. From there, she migrated from one location to another, assuming different identities and accepting various odd jobs to subsist. Her once self-assured and elegant demeanor was supplanted by perpetual anxiety and fear of being recognized. Carla found transient solace in small towns where she could blend into the crowd. She altered her hair color, transformed her appearance, and refrained from forming close connections with anyone. Each time she sensed someone might identify her, she moved on. Her existence evolved into a sequence of transitory sojourns and fleeting moments of tranquility. She deeply yearned for Amanda and frequently reminisced about their shared passion and the dreams they had nurtured. In a tranquil coastal town, far removed from the memories of Belleville, Carla discovered a sense of stability. She secured employment at a local diner, working tirelessly and maintaining a low profile. The town was serene, and its inhabitants were amiable yet respectful of her privacy. After months of turmoil, Carla gradually began to unwind and cautiously lower her guard. She rented a modest apartment and endeavored to rebuild her life, although the fear of exposure never completely abandoned her. Ethan, now an adolescent, grappled with the weight of his family's tragic past. He was a reserved, contemplative young man, often engrossed in his thoughts. Lydia strived to create a nurturing environment, but Ethan couldn't evade the gossip and scrutiny from those aware of his parents' history. School proved challenging, with peers either ostracizing or tormenting him due to his father's crime. Ethan sought refuge in literature and spent countless hours at the local library, losing himself in narratives distant from his reality. Lydia nurtured Ethan's interests, hoping to offer him a constructive outlet. He cultivated a love for writing, channeling his emotions and experiences into his stories. His educators recognized his potential and encouraged him to pursue a career in literature. Despite the darkness that shrouded his past, Ethan discovered hope in the future he could craft for himself. While perusing old family photographs one day, Ethan stumbled upon an image of his parents during happier times. They appeared so enamored, so vibrant. He pondered how everything had unraveled so drastically. Resolute in his quest for understanding, Ethan delved deeper into his family's history. He examined old newspaper articles, conversed with individuals who had known his parents, and reconstructed the narrative of their lives. Ethan's inquiry revealed the affair between his father and Carla. He was shocked and disheartened by the deception, but he also felt an inexplicable connection to Carla. He contemplated her fate following that fateful night. His pursuit of answers led him to contact Mark Collins, the retired private investigator Amanda had engaged. Mark, initially reluctant to revisit past wounds, was touched by Ethan's resolve. Mark divulged the particulars of his investigation, the evidence he had accumulated, and the chain of events that had unfolded. Ethan learned about the confrontation between his mother and Carla, their ensuing affair, and the night his mother was murdered. Ethan experienced a whirlwind of emotions: anger, sorrow, and an overwhelming desire for closure. Determined to locate Carla, Ethan traced the path she had left behind. He traversed the locations she had resided in, conversed with individuals who had crossed paths with her, and meticulously reconstructed her path. The clues ultimately guided him to the quaint coastal town that Carla now called home. Carla was tending to her shift at the diner when Ethan entered. Initially, she didn't recognize him, but as he drew nearer, she noticed a familiar melancholy in his gaze. Ethan acquainted himself, disclosing that he was the offspring of Amanda and Richard. Carla was taken aback, her emotions a swirl of apprehension and optimism. She invited Ethan to join her, and they began to converse. Ethan confided in Carla about his life, his tribulations, and his quest for answers. In return, Carla divulged her narrative, her escape, and her endeavors to reconstruct her life. They conversed for hours, exchanging their sorrow and their recollections of Amanda. Carla admitted her profound affection for Amanda and how the affair had been a source of both joy and anguish. Ethan inquired about the fateful night his mother was taken from him. Carla recounted the events, her voice quivering with emotion. She described Richard's confrontation, his fury and aggression, and her frantic escape. Ethan listened attentively, experiencing a blend of resentment towards his father and empathy for Carla. Ethan chose to remain in the coastal town for a while to further acquaint himself with Carla and to seek some closure. They spent considerable time together, discussing Amanda, sharing anecdotes, and aiding each other in the healing process. Carla found solace in Ethan's company, and Ethan sensed a connection and understanding that had previously eluded him. As time elapsed, the bond between Ethan and Carla strengthened. They became pillars of support for one another, mending the scars of their past. Ethan persisted in his writing, inspired by the tales Carla had imparted and the resilience he witnessed in her. Carla discovered a renewed sense of purpose, assisting Ethan and finding a means to progress with her life. Years elapsed, and Ethan published his debut novel, a fictional rendition of his family's saga. The book garnered critical praise, and Ethan was commended for his emotional profundity and narrative prowess. He dedicated the book to his mother, Amanda, and to Carla, who had demonstrated the significance of comprehension and forgiveness. Carla, on the other hand, persisted in residing in the serene coastal town, discovering tranquility and stability. She maintained contact with Ethan, frequently visiting him and witnessing his evolution into a celebrated author. She discovered comfort in the knowledge that she had assisted Ethan in obtaining closure, and that they had both discovered a path towards healing. The Everwood murders transformed into an infamous case in Belleville, a cautionary narrative of deception, treachery, and the catastrophic repercussions of concealed desires. Amanda's artwork gained substantial recognition, her landscapes now infused with a haunting allure that captivated admirers from distant lands. Richard's once esteemed name became associated with calamity and insanity. Decades later, the town still murmured about Carla Monroe, the mysterious secretary who vanished into the night. Her destiny remained one of Belleville's most significant enigmas, a lingering darkness over the tragic saga of the Everwood family. Ethan matured, bearing the burden of his parents' legacy, resolute in his pursuit to carve a distinct path and liberate himself from the cycle of deception and brutality. Ultimately, the account of the Everwood murders served as a stark reminder of the fragility of human connections and the devastating consequences of secrets and falsehoods. It was a narrative that would be retold for generations, a somber chapter in Belleville's history that would never fade from memory. Ethan persevered in his writing, his compositions frequently delving into themes of love, betrayal, and redemption. His novels resonated with readers, many of whom were oblivious to the true story behind his prose. Despite the bleakness of his past, Ethan discovered a means to transform his anguish into art, crafting something exquisite from the remnants of his family's calamity. In the end, the Everwood murders encompassed more than just a crime. They were a narrative of love, loss, and the enduring power of forgiveness. The lives of those entwined were irrevocably altered, but they found a way to progress, to discover serenity, and forge something new from the wreckage of their past.